Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking with the gals from the What's Your Sign Astrology Podcast about the astrology of comedy and comedians. Hey, welcome, each of you.
Hello.
Oh,
Great to be here.
Yeah, this has been a long time in coming. You have one of the more popular astrology podcasts over the past several years, and you had me on your podcast a few months ago. And during the course of that episode, at some point it came up because each of you are in not just astrology, but also comedy. And I mentioned that it would be really great to do an episode on the astrology of comedy and comedians. So here we are doing that today.
Yeah.
So mote it be. We're here in the digital flesh, and thank you so much for having us. It's a dream come true.
Yeah, thank you. We're so excited to be here.
Yeah, so each of you, so your names are Stevie Anderson, Julia Loken, and Lisa Chanoux, and you each do comedy as well as astrology, right?
Yes. I'm a Goldstein now. I got married. Well, we all got married last year. That's another episode of the astrology of why did we all get married in 2022. But yeah, Anderson and Goldstein will come up in the Google searches.
Gotcha. Okay.
And yes, to comedy.
And how long have you been doing the podcast now?
We just celebrated our 5-year anniversary in February.
Mm-hmm. We launched on a new moon eclipse. So eclipses can be good, despite the fear that I feel like comes up when it is eclipse season, which we will be heading into by the time this comes out as well. So
that's true.
Eclipses can really open portals, as they say.
I do feel like starting a podcast is very eclipse energy because it is something that you just like have to do. You just have to pick it. You just start it and you just decide that this is when it goes, and it goes from not being a podcast existing to existing and just going like, okay, let's see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So it felt very fitting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. I'm a fan of eclipses because sometimes I always say they indicate great beginnings and great endings. And while that energy can be kind of chaotic, sometimes really momentous things happen under it, like you starting your podcast, or I published my book under a lunar eclipse, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about, let's see, what is our entry point into this? One of the ways I was thinking about it is in ancient astrology, astrologers were associated with Mercury because they were seen to be like translators of the stars.
Mm-hmm.
And astrology was seen as a language, and Mercury was the planet that had to do with communication. And when I was thinking about that, though, there's many different Mercury type professions and Mercury type fields that have to do with speech and communication. And I couldn't think of one that's more fitting for that Mercury type role in modern times than like the role of the stand-up comedian and the person that literally gets up in front of like a room full of people and just like talks and tries to make people laugh, essentially, is basically like what they're attempting to do, right?
Yeah, I think it's all of the facets of Mercury too, because it's not only the literal talking, it's also the writing, it's also the processing and synthesis of ideas, and then also sharing that in both written and spoken form.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, maybe this isn't, I think this is a good warning for your audience, is like since we are comedy people and not historians, if you will, it was really interesting to me just starting to dig into the history of comedy, because just like astrology, I was like, oh wow, this is quite old. Like this is older than I thought it would be, which makes sense in terms of like court jesters and clowns. And like, I mean, it's the Wikipedia goes deep, if you go to just straight up comedy. And I think the intention being to make someone laugh was always like the through line. And then also for plays and things like of that nature, it was always a happy ending. And I thought that was like another great distinction from drama or tragedy or whatever it might be. But yeah, not a hot take, but wow, it's pretty old was what I've realized looking back. But I do think stand up, and I looked into like the first stand up, which was quite interesting, but like stand up, and I think the film and television is where we really have what we know as like modern comedy.
Yeah,
I find it Go ahead. I find it real Mercury too, because it happens in the room. And I think there is a feeling that happens when you're having a conversation and things really start flowing. And I think that can happen in a room. And when we see it translated on TV, it's not always as buzzy or mercurial. Obviously we have like, the screen and maybe some Neptune energy entering into that space or something else. But when you're really in a room and either watching or performing, it's such a mercurial feeling.
I like that too, because it's also thinking about the audience itself being mercurial to the magic of it in the room, but also having to literally like take the temperature of the room, and also watching stand-up, engaging with stand-up, I think is mercurial. Maybe, I don't know, is laughter Mercury? That feels I feel like it must be, but also feels kind of like Martian in a expelling
impulse
way. But yeah.
Kind of moon-like too. I feel like it's like, well, is it all the planets? But it does feel like what tickles your fancy feels very like that moon Venus sort of energy. And then that also I just like this, or this just hits for me. Like the je ne sais quoi of just art, that can be hard to encapsulate with words, even though that's what the medium also is communicating who you are, or a joke or an idea, or just like a persona. A lot of the times too, I think can definitely be involved with comedy. Is a lot of times these people who are in comedy are not always it's themselves, but like a different version of themselves for an audience.
With the moon too, I mean, comedy generally happens at night. And so I can see that having like, the lunar effects of it. I mean, there are daytime comedy shows, but they tend to not feel the same.
I thought you were going to say something else, Lisa. They tend to be during the day.
Yeah. And in terms of like, one of the things I think it's really interesting with the rise of like podcasts and like comedy podcasts is you hear a lot of, especially when comedians are interviewing other comedians, about the craft of comedy, or like the craft of like developing a bit or refining it, or having that interplay with the audience, or the tension between like developing new material versus using old material and things like that. And there's so many interesting things about comedy as a profession. As well as just that there's different comedians approach things in different ways, and clearly have sometimes very distinct personalities, and they develop their followings based on sometimes whatever their personality is. And their approach to comedy is like attracting people in different ways because it sort of hits different spots. And to the extent that one's personality can sometimes be seen, or one's manner of communication can be seen through the birth chart, I thought it might be interesting to look at some different charts today for different comedians to see if we can understand that as a lens through which to understand different people's unique approach to comedy and to making people laugh through astrology.
I love it.
Absolutely.
Let's do it. I think that hits a good point too, and from like our research, it's not like there's no Aquarian comedians, right? There's comedians of all signs. And I think going back to like any sign can be funny, but then also like, what is the through line of their different personal placements or aspects that are forming in the chart, or even just their timing? We can, maybe it's a spoiler alert, but I was looking into Joan Rivers in particular, because I think her story is very interesting one, especially in terms of society, right? Like, I think, when is society even ready for someone like Joan? Or, is it just the timing too of when they're ready to be entered in a more like public accepted space?
Right, for sure. So she was like an early example of like a woman that was successful as a stand-up comedian in like the mid to late 20th century.
Yeah, and late night was her main. I think that was like the main threshold of being the first. Again, like maybe there was someone else that was the first late night host, but I don't think so. I believe she was like the first woman in late night television after striking up with Friendship. Oh, there she is.
Here's her chart. We actually
there's Joni.
We have a time chart. It's like sort of rounded. It's like 2 a.m., but she was born July 8th, 1933 at 2 a.m. in Brooklyn, New York, with probably early Aries rising, the moon in Sagittarius, and Mercury conjunct Venus and the sun. And that's actually kind of interesting, because I was trying to look up, I pulled up the text of the 2nd century astrologer Vedius Valens, and he talks about Mercury signifying communication and people that are good with words and people that are clever. But then when I searched for the word laughter or laughing, it actually came up with the Venus as one of the like positive facets of Venus, is like something that's enjoyable or pleasurable. or makes you feel good. And so it's almost like it's some combination potentially of those two, of like Venus and Mercury, at least in terms of some of those older texts.
That's interesting. That makes sense too, in terms of Venus and style too, not only a comedian style, but also you, the audience members' taste and preference and what you find enjoyable. And it isn't necessarily, I mean, some people like real body, real gross out humor kinds of things. And I wonder if that would be reflected in a Venus aspect. But I think mostly there is, at the very least, something enjoyable about a punchline, like rhythmically hitting the notes that you expect it to, or something that feels very Venusian. And when things don't work, that is also like a missed punchline sort of thing.
Right.
When you start too, everyone tells you to talk about things you care about. And it does feel like a lot of the time when it's personal, and that it makes it even more relatable to others. So I guess that values thing with Venus too.
Well,
absolutely.
And for the audience too, you're probably going to go see someone you like or like that aligns with your values, or is saying what I was thinking with Joan, just seeing how much third house energy she had too. Like Mercury and Venus together, she talks about her appearance and her looks and her place as in the earlier days as like a mother and a housewife sort of figure, but then obviously breaking that mold. And I think the third house, like, I don't know, sometimes when I look at a chart, I just get like a flash of a sentence. And for Jones, it was just saying what we're thinking. And I think that lends true to a lot of comedians, but especially, I mean, come on, Gemini, Sun, Sagittarius, Moon, all this stuff. It's just so potent. And then I think too, that T square to her Mars in the 6th, to like poking fun at everyday sort of things, the mundane, like that's something we see so often in comedy. And I think she's just such like a blueprint too for that style, and just, I don't know, just being unapologetically herself as well.
Aries rising, I think, is very
so
palatable too, like to an audience. And I think if you're different than what people have seen in the past, you're a woman, and that's not really the common thing, then being palatable and people to be able to get it and be able to kind of flow in the natural natal chart makes sense.
Yeah. With Uranus there, I mean, just being herself is radical.
I think Uranus is really potent in a comedian chart. I think it is not only like the archetype of the bolt of inspiration and kind of genius and ideas, but also the archetype of being a radical, being someone that also is kind of an outsider, because when you are performing comedy, you are the only person on stage. You're standing up in front of everyone, and you might be saying what everybody is thinking, but you are the one saying it, and kind of like taking that risk, being in the spotlight, being the lightning rod for those things. And I think not only that, also it speaks to me to a comedian's cultural significance. We all have Uranus in our chart, but I think that something that I noticed for almost every comedian that I looked at is a strongly aspected Uranus in some way. It differs, and I think that it reflects their cultural contributions. But I think that for someone to not only be able to like tap into our collective consciousness and also be the voice of it, that to me is very Uranian.
I was thinking about that recently, actually, with Norm Macdonald, because I was watching some comedians talk about him, and they said the thing that stood out about him, among other things, in his approach to comedy is that sometimes he would find a really unique way to like approach a bit that would surprise other comedians with its like innovativeness of like that they wouldn't have thought of that. And I think that's a very Uranian thing. And he actually had Mercury square Uranus. To your point, we don't have a time chart for him, but here's his chart with Mercury at 12 Scorpio, and it's sort of widely applying to a square with Uranus at 20 Leo.
Yeah,
I also Julia's husband saw him do a set one political direction, and then the following night do the exact opposite, which I think is very Libra sun. Like to see like, oh, let's see both sides, see what people laugh at, and then pick things out, and like
right, as well as very Uranian in terms of not wanting to be pinned down and wanting to be rebellious or something. And that's actually what he got. It's kind of why he got fired from SNL in the 90s, because he was doing a lot of jokes about O.J. Simpson, and his boss at the time, the head of the network, was like, was a friend of O.J. Simpson, so he told him he had to stop doing those jokes, and he sort of rebelled against that, and he said no, and he kept doing it, and so they got rid of him basically.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And again, another like Uranian kind of thing of like the rebel, and also kind of the, I don't know, someone who is poking. People like it, and comedy goes well, but it is also kind of dangerous and kind of not, I don't want to say dangerous, because I feel like that's like also a buzzword that people are saying now.
Well,
you can't say anything you want, but I mean, yeah, there literally were people who were arrested for doing stand-up comedy, which we'll get to, I think, later on. But that idea, yes, of like you said, of not being able to pin down, of saying what you want, and there's just such a strong Uranian streak to me in comedy.
And but going back to your point, Lisa, about Libra, that's true also of Norm, just because of that strong Sun Mars conjunction. And Libras can have that feeling of like wanting to be like opposite to something, or to play like the counterbalancing role to something. And you can see that sometimes come up as like a strong tendency with Libras. I see it sometimes even with like skeptics of like, if everyone is doing this, then they're going to like take the opposite side and say, no, that's wrong, or this is the other end of the spectrum of that.
Wow.
Also, I mean, Anthony Jeselnik is a Capricorn sun with a Libra moon. We don't have the time. But everyone in comedy always talks about, he's very dark on stage. I mean, he'll go all the way in, but everyone that knows him always talks about how nice he is off stage. And so I think there is, again, that like, I'm going to take the other side to this and really balance my life in this way.
And another Sun Mars.
I was going to say, look at that.
I think conjunctions, again, not a sign specific comedy signature, but I think that conjunctions are also very comedy to me, because one of the things that you would read about a conjunction as far as significations would be like tunnel vision on something. And I think when we talk about comedians, we're often talking about someone who has a strong opinion about something or a strong point of view. And I think that seeing those conjunctions, whatever planets they are, I think Mars also to me fits, because we literally give punchlines, and that's so Mars to me.
The notion of like going into a room, and when a comedian does really well, they say that they killed that room, or they really killed.
Yes, the delivery, the assertiveness of Mars. I think you'll see it in different places. It's not always necessarily conjunct the sun, but I think that is also like very like you would describe Anthony Jeselnik's humor as like sharp to something with that Sun Mars conjunction. But I think the conjunctions, we saw it in Joan Rivers too. I think that's interesting with the Mercury Venus conjunction, and that she would then go on to do so much fashion commentary and red carpet work, which I think is also very fitting. But I think the conjunctions in conjunction with tense aspects is that like fighting for differing points of views and needing to deliver something like that you feel strongly.
I just like that I can tell Libras when they're being annoying. Chris Brennan said, "You're just taking the opposite side just because."
Right.
Now I know. I'm just gonna. This is my pull quote. I'm like, it's not me.
I like
Chris Brennan says.
Yeah, you're gonna
I like that.
I'm gonna get canceled with Libras because of you.
I like the idea that comedians that get off stage and say they killed, because usually they didn't. But that is a very Mars thing to come off and be all like,
well, you don't want to get up there too and be like, you have to sell it, even when you're sucking. It's sad when you don't. It's sad if you see someone just take the defeat. Like, you just have to still battle, even if you are being defeated by an audience.
Right. And isn't that part of the process of like learning to do stand-up, is like going up there and subjecting yourself to that, where most people are going to do pretty bad early on. And people might not laugh, or they might not do very well, but through doing that over and over again, you sort of learn how to do it. But it's a process that's not necessarily easy and doesn't come naturally to every person.
Yeah, that's another planet that you would not necessarily think of as comedic, but Saturn, I think, also kind of speaks to a comedian's success and ability to endure, because stand-up is tons and tons and tons of repetition, like you just said it, and you are pretty bad at it at the beginning, and it's a skill that really builds on itself. Also think it's interesting that sometimes we refer to someone's act as like their stand-up routine, which is very, I go, oh, that's Saturn That's Saturn too. Idea of also having the discipline and the form to say the things that you intend to say every time, and to be like working on that, chipping away at that. I think seeing where Saturn is in a comedian's chart also can kind of speak to the heights that they're able to reach, and also the longevity of their careers.
And doing it over and over and over. And I mean, how many times do you do a joke that I have one that I've been doing for 10 years, and inside I go, oh, I can't believe you're still doing this.
Yeah.
But outside you have to be like, this is my favorite joke.
And sometimes you still do, like, or maybe you don't, but I can find sometimes you do naturally just get to the natural response that you had when you first started writing it, because both that is like so ingrained in doing it for so long. I don't know.
I think that's why, because Julie and Lisa, and check out the Chatterbox Comedy Night, which we'll plug at the end again. But when I dabbled in stand-up, I couldn't keep going because of the repetition. And that's when I went into more independent radio shows and podcasting, because the patience to repeat yourself, even though I repeat stories all the time, but not like by choice, I guess, just by not having the memory of a goldfish. But I'm going to blame my mutual reception with Gemini, Mercury, and Aries. Or no, excuse me, my Cancer, Mars, and Aries moon, where I'm just like, no, it's like, it is. I think that diligence is an underrated skill, because repeating yourself over and over and like it's the first time it's not easy.
And I think that goes back to Mercury too, because a lot of the times you're testing and seeing, I'm going to try this in front of this, or I'm going to move that there. But you still have to do the same joke or the same material in different order, or it's a different older crowd, younger crowd, all of those types of things. And so sometimes it can feel brand new when it's words you've said so many times, but sometimes it's a slog, or sometimes it doesn't go well. And you're like, I've been doing this joke for 10 years. What do you mean you're not laughing? So there is that I don't know, kind of investigation happening.
Well, and Joan, just sorry to come back to Joan, but I deep dived her, but she finally made it on the Tonight Show with Carson after 7 auditions over 3 years. Like, it wasn't, you got it, kid. Like, let's keep you moving. There was the grind, and also the grind, which we also hear in comedy.
Her collection of note cards that in her documentary of just little set lists and jokes and things. It was, massive.
Well, what's her Uranus?
Aries in the first house.
Because I think that's another thing to thinking of comedy in terms of when their own timing, and that being like a cultural moment that's ready for them, and you can be as radical, but if the culture isn't ready to hear what you have to say, then it's like easily dismissible sort of thing. But being ready for all of those things, she had jokes about every single subject categorized alphabetically in this thing. So that's very Aries rising, and Uranus and Aries to me of being just Virgo ready to capture, ready to capture any moment as soon as it's happening. But
we'll get this on her when she finally made it on Carson, February 17th, 65. Pluto exactly conjunct her chart ruler, her Mars, Virgo. That was like, it's like, you're ready, kid. Like, let's do this thing. Yeah. And then she also had Saturn conjunct, or Venus conjunct her natal Saturn too, like a degree apart. But Pluto was like right on it at the same degree.
I also think that this mutable, it's not, again, we can't say that a sign by sign thing, but I do think that this Gemini Sag axis to me is very comedy too, and with the T-square to Virgo, I think those, like, the nitpickiness, the I don't know, all of those things, but in the kind of outrageous communication, big idea, small, micro, macro, and like the details about it, is so comedian.
I mean, that's funny that you should say that, because every time I think about, unfortunately, the that axis at this point, I can't get over one of the most prominent examples that we've had of that in recent times, which was somebody that was born with a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius opposite to his Gemini sun.
Oh, no, I think I know who you're saying.
Oh, we know. Hey, the comedy is strong. Okay.
I mean,
it's undeniable. unfortunately, it is a powerful comedic force.
There's a different timeline universe, like Everything Everywhere All at Once, where he's just a stand-up killing it, you know?
Right.
And we're all
are loving it.
Yes.
We're all like, yes, this is what you're supposed to be.
We have universal
doing.
health care, and he's just, has a residency in Vegas, and all is well.
You are meant to be a clown, not
not president of the United States.
Not president.
Okay. So we're talking about Trump's chart. So Donald Trump has,
of course, he weasels his way in here too.
Moon,
every time. Every time.
No.
Sorry to go there, but
no,
so
it's good.
Moon at 21 Sag, opposite to the sun at 22, and that was one of the things when he first made his rise during that the primaries in 2015 and 2016 he was just like tearing apart his rivals through these devastating sort of broadly like comedic, but also just like mean like attacks on their character and everything else,
nicknames and stuff.
He's still doing the nickname thing. What's his
loves
nickname?
The nicknames. What's DeSantis's nickname? I can't.
It's like Tommy Meatballs or something like that. Like Tommy Spaghetti. Like
it's I believe that.
It's
you
very,
can't. I think that's the Gemini Sag thing where it's like it's not even necessarily true. It's not even necessarily this, but it is like fun. It's funny in the moment, and you kind of can't escape it anymore. It's like it's in there.
They coined it or something.
Yeah.
I also feel like it's, again, going back to Mars, it's burns. It's like roast jokes, their responses.
Another less
very like fifth grade like bullied sort of humor, but there's still like that is a version of the comedy archetype, or that's like a piece of it.
Well, that's the Gemini Sun, Sag Moon. We also see the flip of this. Tiffany Haddish is someone who has Sagittarius Sun, Gemini Moon, and I think that's like a more of a big personality who also can say things that's less kind of like personally attacking and more like, this is who I am and I can kind of say whatever I want, and that also can kind of like catapult someone. She also has I was like, she also has that Mercury Uranus conjunction, which I mean to me is pure comedy. But I also, and she has this T-square then to all of this Virgo stuff up at the top, which I think is
So let's just describe it for people listening to the audio version. So she has the moon at 10 degrees of Gemini and the sun at 10 Sag, and it's squaring her Mars at 5 Virgo and Jupiter at 9 Virgo.
And I think that
another Mars Virgo T-square.
It's
wild.
And I think that is that like meteoric rise. I also think that we see that Jupiter in fall there too, which is the thing that's like not necessarily, it's a big ascension, but not necessarily the way that you want to, or in a way that makes you open to criticism. I think I've noticed also as a trend in comedians who have Jupiter in detriment.
Sure. So let's go back to, because that was a really interesting and important point, because we're seeing different manifestations of comedy through different planetary combinations. And one of the ones we were just talking about was like Mars and Mars's role in comedy, and how that might be tied in with like that feeling of like killing, or or comedy bits that are biting or have this acerbic nature, like roasts, for example, like would be a very Mars thing, where you're actually actively sort of almost like attacking somebody, but doing it in a comedic way, so it's making people laugh, or you're sort of like tearing somebody down, but doing it in the context of comedy. And in some controlled contexts, that's kind of like okay, or is permissible, like for example in the context of a roast.
I think, well, in a roast technically too, I mean now roast battle has changed that a little bit, where it used to be like an honor, where you're honoring one person and everyone kind of goes through the dais and roast somebody. And I think that's interesting because it happens in a way where there is a little bit of back and forth. People kind of talk about each other that are on the panel or whatever, and of course the person you're honoring. But now in roast battle, it's very much like a fight, like, hey, these two people are going up against each other.
That's a really good point. And that actually, even outside of roasts, there's also like comedy battles, or where two comedians are just like going at each other, and then sometimes that being judged, or that's been a really popular format over the past decade, it seems like.
Totally.
Yeah.
That's interesting too, thinking of it being very Mars as like a personal planet and these being personal attacks too, instead of, like you were saying, Lisa, the kind of like honorable roast attack, which is on someone's long and storied career or, you know, relevance this way, instead of, I think now the roast or even comedian kind of like beefs with each other are very personal, very ad hominem.
I think it's also just Mars's energy too. You know, we've all been at long stand-up shows and then someone just comes on and like comes like a bat out of hell and you're just like, whoa, like you have the stage brought some life into you and you're then bringing life into your audience too. I didn't think about, like, Mars is just kind of like popped its way into the comedy chat. Like Mercury makes a lot of sense, but yeah, Mars and Uranus are holding court.
Another person,
if you look at it from the comedian's perspective too, no matter what your level of ability is, like comedy is happening for you on stage in the physical body. And it's like, there are things you don't learn how to control your foot tapping for a long time or your hand shaking and those things. And it is, to me, that is so Martian that you are like, I'm here in my I have to be present. I have to be here.
Well, even thinking about talking for an hour. I mean, we do it on podcasts, and that's, I think it is an endurance activity. You don't necessarily think of that because you just think of someone, you know, talking. Oh, it's not necessarily like physically active, but when you're doing an hour, you're moving the stage, and most people who are doing hours are also doing it for a large audience, and they need to be moving and addressing different sections. They're not just like sitting and standing and they're, unless you're, you know,
and your heart rate's high.
A certain comedian,
but you know, I check my Apple Watch. I'm like, oh, I didn't know it was nervous tonight.
This made me think of another manifestation of this Sag Gemini axis with a square to Virgo in Kevin Hart's chart. It's not his sun, but he has Moon and Sag, Mars and Gemini, which are in opposition to each other, both square his Mars. I mean, his Mars square Saturn. Sorry, maybe I'm looking at my wrong notes. Let me pull them up. I know he has Virgo.
Here it is.
Yeah.
It was just taking me a minute to pull up the chart. So
no, it's like Virgo.
Hart, just a time
Virgo
chart
rising. That's Saturn.
Yeah. So
also just a lot of the charts have been so one-sided. Like a lot of the times we haven't seen too many splays, not to say that there's probably not some in the mix, but just the folks who've come up so far have been very like all in one sort of quadrant or hemisphere. It's like been a lot of concentration in one chunk.
I think interestingly too, I didn't know he was a Cancer sun, but I do find that Cancer sun comedians talk about their families. And I'm just thinking of one recent Kevin Hart bit, maybe doesn't do it that much, but he talks about going to the school and like a PTA meeting and stuff. Very funny. But Fluffy's another Cancer sun who it's like he talks about his son and his wife, and that I think that's interesting.
I can't believe Fluffy's a Cancer. That's
of course
Cancer.
His name is Fluffy.
Of course he is, and he did one of the biggest shows in his hometown.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
didn't he have a quinceañera for his Chihuahua?
His Chihuahua, yes.
Yeah.
So Cancer. So Cancer.
So I think one of the things we're coming up with then is that it's not that there's going to be certain placements that will mean like only comedians have this placement or something like that, but rather a person's chart is going to reflect their style of comedy as well as some of the topics that they'll tend to gravitate towards, as well as their style of delivery.
Yeah, I think that's evident in a lot with sun signs. I mean, you know, if we think of it as identity, Taurus comedians tend to be observational. I mean, you can kind of look at them. I know Bill Burr has a Cancer rising. I think he seems very everyman to every, you know, people feel like they know him. He's very, I don't know, salt of the earth.
Totally. And I'm thinking of Seinfeld as the Taurus with observation.
Nathan Fielder's a very observational in a different artistic, definitely a different way than Seinfeld, but he's still observing.
Yeah. Letting people sort of letting it breathe and like letting people kind of show their own asses, if you will.
Oh, and that Mars Mercury.
Oh my, Mars yet again.
Bill Burr's chart, and we have another full moon with the moon in Sagittarius opposite the sun, Venus and Mars in Gemini.
And
that's trippy.
I mean, not exactly, but squaring that Pluto. I mean, by sign energy, I think that having that, you know, Uranus Pluto on the
Mhm.
IC, not by degree squaring that axis, but I think we still see the influence of the like nitpicky that. And again, another person who like had to hit a moment.
And
Mhm.
I
Sure.
think also, speaking of Cancer stuff, I mean, he helps other comedians, and from what I've heard, is very generous to them when they open for him. He definitely, I've heard, I won't say where, but like asks, "Do you want me to watch you?" Which I think
Mhm.
that's a really nice thing to do for somebody.
Mhm.
Nurturing and
Yeah.
supportive, and also thinking of like, I mean, just like literally calling him crabby, I think is very apt.
And he gets like red in
He
the
gets red,
face,
exactly.
like,
It's like
yeah.
getting all red like that too. Yes.
So you're saying that because he has Cancer rising?
Yeah.
Yes.
Like a
Yeah.
crab.
I think
Got it.
that's like how he would.
Well, with a fire moon too, like real steamy crab
Mhm.
energy.
On this aquatic tip, I think an interesting on both of these things that we're talking about, the rising sign and also delivery and all this, Ellen DeGeneres I think has a really interesting chart for her.
Oh, I haven't looked at Ellen's chart before.
She's a Pisces rising and is best known for playing a fish, I would say now, not always throughout her career, but one of her biggest roles was a fish. Or do you have her not a Pisces rising, or do we not have a birth time?
I don't know. I have it for some reason as a noon chart, which is usually when I don't know the time, but it depends.
I think we had her on our list as a Pisces rising, so I could also be.
Let
Hey,
me check.
we might have to.
But that's worth discussing just in terms of, I liked the point about Bill Burr and like his appearance sometimes when he's giving comedy, and sometimes like how somebody comes off or what their appearance is in style and an initial presentation versus their sort of like internal way of processing things and their internal monologue or way of interpreting things that might be more associated with other planets like the sun or the moon or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
I think too with that back to his like Sag moon was in the 6th. I feel like that very like hands up, like, why are you doing the things you're doing? It's very Sag moon 6 stuff of like, I can't comprehend why you all do things this way. I think he talks in these very big picture society at large. And if we all just did this thing sort of differently, it's not lectury though. Like there's always still like a sweetness to him, but it is like, it like everything ends with like, you idiots, basically in the context.
I think it's also funny that he usually says, "I'm an idiot."
He
Right.
softens, he disarms
also,
them.
Yeah, which I think is both Cancer and Sag moon to me.
He's calling them
this.
idiots when he's saying I'm
this is very much my idea, and that Gemini Sag kind of axis too to me is very much like my truth. Obviously, we're speaking about big philosophical truths too when we're thinking of Sagittarius, but I do think that with the Cancer, where it's like this is me, this is how I feel, but also what do I know?
Yeah, well, the ability, especially so with his Cancer rising and Mercury in Cancer, and just Cancer, something might be the ability to be self-deprecating, as opposed to, let's say, the opposite of that, which would be like self-aggrandizing, which would be more of like a Leo thing or maybe a Sagittarius thing.
Or even Capricorn on the flip side too. Like maybe is not as braggy, but more factual. Like I've done this, I have this cred to back up whatever it is I'm talking about. But we see Capricorn, I feel like a lot too, maybe a sign we haven't talked much about, but I feel like there's a lot of Capricorn comedians and Capricorn moon. I know we've talked on our podcast about a through line of like Capricorn having that sort of dark, I'm thinking of like Sarah Silverman, like as a dark sense of humor or just like a little twisted. And Cap moon seemed to be it's a placement we would see, but now we've been seeing all these Sag moons. I'm like, what the hell am I talking about Cap moons over here now?
Sarah Silverman and Richard Pryor, I believe, are the same birthday, and both Sag sun, Cap moon. As am I, no big deal. I don't want to say that I'm also
amongst royalty,
pantheon, but we are, we are what we are. And I think that, with Sarah, there's this is like one side so heavy, but I also think that like, I don't know, let's talk about Sarah.
Yeah, I liked the Capricorn and Saturn part is important because Saturn can be really good at being critical and seeing the flaws in things, as well as sometimes having a tendency towards seeing the darker side of life or things that are some people can consider to be morbid. And that's something that Capricorn and Scorpio share in common. So that might be a good area for us to explore here for a little bit, which is just that ability either to be highly critical or to focus on things that other people might consider like dark.
Mm-hmm. Totally. Well, just I'm thinking of Sarah now too, of having her one era of her stand-up be about how she wet the bed for a very long time. And I think there is that like Capricorn. I should have not done this by now, but I did not. So now I'm going to really put this on display in a very critical but like reflective, harsh love back towards this sort of like inner child. I also think too, maybe the first person we've talked about that also incorporated music, it like singing, bringing out the guitar. I think
she
also
has that
very
Neptune. Neptune in there.
I think it's very like that can be kind of Cap, because it's like, maybe I can sing my feelings and then they won't be as vulnerable or something, or like as real.
That brings up also sometimes like Sarah, sometimes in her earlier comedy would go there with like almost like gross out humor, or almost got a kick out of like kind of grossing people out sometimes with things that you normally maybe wouldn't talk about in a stand-up set. And so for the audio listeners, she has Sagittarius rising with the Sun and Mercury in Sag along with Neptune, but the ruler of her ascendant is Jupiter, which is in Scorpio in the 12th house with Venus, opposite to Saturn in Taurus, and then the moon is in Capricorn in the second whole sign house.
I also think that Neptune, 0 degrees Sag to me is very sacrilegious, and also very like, I don't know, she does a lot of critique about religion and those kinds of things, like but also plays someone, her character is kind of a delusional character, which I think is very Neptune conjunct the ascendant in Sagittarius, like very, she both is like, there is no God, but also I am God, and in several ways, in both like material and character. And I think that's very fitting. I also think that Capricorn moon, and maybe this is like not true, but I guess it's like the cardinal of being able to be, I'm thinking of her as like being a woman who is kind of singularly successful in a way that other women aren't. And I don't want to say that that's just Capricorn moon, but I think being able to excel in a male dominated field, and also being the kind of only the first is also, I don't know, just interesting.
Well, she's like hangs with the boys, like historically, like the Gary. Now I'm thinking about what I got to see Gary Shandling's chart now, is where my mind just went. Cause now I'm thinking of like what a manifester he was. And I think they had crossover too.
Well, I think a really wild card Capricorn is Andy Kaufman.
Totally.
I think, it's definitely experimental and all of those things, but think of him just reading a book, like page by page at a thing, just to like incense people, or to get a reaction. So I think that that's an interesting
committing to the bit is very
holding it as long as possible.
Oh my god, the Saturn moon conjunction, look at that.
So describe it.
So we have this Virgo moon conjunct Saturn in the second house with his Leo rising. We're looking at Andy Kaufman, Capricorn sun, Leo rising. Rising conjunct Pluto too, so like he would punish Pluto the audience.
Right Pluto is right on the ascendant, and that can be really good for like sticking with something, because Leo is already like a fixed sign, but Pluto there can give you like real staying power at the same time, and that's opposite to Mercury at 16 Aquarius and Mars at 10 degrees of Aquarius,
and Mercury a magnetism too.
Yeah, and I think Mercury Aquarius, the voices like doing weird out of I don't know, something with voices comes to me.
Yeah, just a weirdo, like he was the OG weirdo. And I always think if anyone would try to be Kaufman-esque now, we would just be like, he's done it first. Like there's also something, just you broke this mold. But it's wild to think Jim Carrey too is also a Capricorn.
Actually, I wrote that in there, and he's a Gemini.
Gemini sun, but isn't he Cap rising?
Cap rising, yes.
Wait.
No, he's a Capricorn. He's a Capricorn sun.
Yeah, Jim Carrey's
I was
charts.
like,
why do I have
I had a Gemini chart somewhere too. Okay.
Oh, this is Jim Carrey. I'm sorry, the hockey player. I know we're all familiar. Clearly.
Oh yeah,
we're all familiar.
The more famous Jim Carrey. How can
James Carrey.
Yeah, because he famously stayed in character too when he played Andy Kaufman for Man on the Moon and like would not release. And I think if I saw that chart right, also had like some Leo placements going on with that Capricorn.
29-degree
opposite
Leo
rising.
Uranus too. That conjunct the midheaven. I mean, about that to me is like very powerful manifesting. Literally write your own check, which is his famous story where he wrote himself a check for $1 million, had it up on the wall forever, and was like, one day I'll be able to cash this. And I think that like quincunx Capricorn, we've talked about this a lot on our podcast, as kind of those like aspects that aren't traditional aspects, but are that like je ne sais quoi about someone. And I think that Leo Capricorn are very powerful, like achieving energies. And I think Jim Carrey is both like respected as a comedian because of how far he was able to push himself and what he was willing to do to be a character, and literally would go to like physical lengths and all of that too. But also I would say was at one point, I think, the highest paid actor and all those things. So too, I mean, like systemically successful, and also I don't know what's the word.
I mean, he really just was a breakout. Everybody, like, I feel like kids would be Jim Carrey. At least like growing up, they'd be like, I'm doing the Jim Carrey face, or like had that signature style that was very emulated. And
to me, that Uranus again.
Looking at his chart, he has Saturn right at 1 degree of Aquarius, and he just has this whole group of planets of the Sun, Venus, and Mars
again
in late Capricorn, and then Saturn, Jupiter, Mercury in the South Node in Aquarius. And that means that he would have been going through a Saturn return in the early to mid 90s when he hit the height of his fame. So Jim Carrey's Saturn return would have been basically hitting the height of his sort of comedic field at that point, because he had that 1 year where like 2 or 3 of his biggest movies like all came out in the same year, I think, right? It was like
Ace Ventura,
like Ace Ventura and Dumb and Dumber. I think it was like all in the same year.
Hitmaker.
Another Mercury Aquarius, weird voices, faces, those like interesting, alrighty then, like those, I don't know.
Physical.
It's the quotables too. It's all of, I mean, yeah. And things, culture changing, culture capturing, culture defining. I mean, so many quotes that I feel like people know still. That's like,
even if they don't know where it's from, they like know that quote.
So that brings up 2 things. One, that now we've gotten into timing of him having his Saturn return and really hitting that sort of high point comedically in terms of the direction that he'd been building up for several years, starting as a stand-up comedian in the 80s and then going into comedy and doing skits on like In Living Color, and then from that parlaying that into like a huge movie career. But one thing that's interesting is that he then would have had his Saturn return in the early to mid 90s. But from a timing standpoint, he seemed like he wanted to go further than that. And he didn't just want to be known as a comedian or a comedy actor. And remember, he had that real like abrupt turn around that time period where he went into dramatic roles. And he did that movie, first The Cable Guy, and then eventually where he was playing like a dark character that was like kind of supposed to be funny, but it was actually much more kind of dark and disturbing. And then eventually into much more serious dramatic roles with like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind and things like that.
Truman Show, which was also very, voyeuristic, and being this performing monkey too, of sort, like we want you to just be this guy. And I feel like those roles really reflected rebellion.
I think that's very Capricorn too, of kind of reaching a pinnacle in your category and then needing to move on to the next thing, because then we get to late in life career Jim Carrey, who's like, actually now I'm an artist and like a spiritual person, and I'm actually like not funny at all. I'm very zen.
Now he's just gonna voice on The Weeknd's new album because they're actually neighbors and they met and became friends, and he was like, sure, I'll do the radio announcer voice in your album, but only because we happen to live next door and be friends with each other, which is pretty wild. And he's just gonna draw like crude drawings of like George W. Bush on Twitter.
Very third neighbors,
Yeah,
I think Saturn returns too are such an interesting time for comedians. I know we've talked about on our podcast Eddie Murphy giving up comedy during his Saturn return and attempting to return to stand up during his second Saturn return. However, COVID-19 thwarted that a little bit. He also fathered his first child during his Saturn return, and there's a number of other comics who've had big career changes happen during their Saturn return. I think John Mulaney's first Emmy win is like 2 degrees from his natal Saturn. We don't have a time either, so it's not like maybe the most accurate. But him and I think Bo Burnham's inside happened while Saturn was in the same sign, though not exactly conjunct his natal Saturn.
Yeah, that was his Saturn return.
And I see from your notes too, Chris, it's like Dane Cook had a gnarly Saturn return. I was like, wait, I need to hear more about this gnarly Saturn return.
More recently, Pete Davidson, I just noticed, has Saturn in Aquarius. So like the past 3 years where Pete Davidson is just like constantly in the news and seemed to have hit the high point of both his career as well as his notoriety due to his personal life, has been part of his Saturn return.
Well, it's interesting thinking about comedian Saturn returns because it is like what you have built your material on then becomes like what you are known for. And how does that then like what you've been doing repetitively, also personally, professionally, whatever, is now, I don't know, public. Not for everybody, I don't think, because not everybody reaches those successful levels, but I think.
Well, he's a unique case too, just how young he started, like going into comedy clubs underage. Like I know that's not a totally unique story for a lot of comedians. A lot start and in their teenage years, but not many people like skip college to go straight to SNL. Like that's a very unique experience.
Let me find his chart.
Yeah, now I'm curious. Now I gotta see this chart. I gotta see why is he snatching up all these babes? Like, well, he's a Scorpio.
Scorpio. Right?
Yeah.
I mean,
but I need more. I need to look under the hood. He's like just a constant, like he's just hit like a pop culture iconic. We know the tattoos, the nonchalant sort of gravelly voice, like though just like OG F-boy vibes.
There it is. I just found it. Hold on a sec. Okay, here's his chart.
Holding for Davidson's chart.
Right. Well, obviously, here we go. This Uranus.
Oh my god.
Uranus Neptune conjunction.
Untimed chart, but this is Pete Davidson, who has a Scorpio stellium with Jupiter, Mercury, Venus, Sun, Pluto.
Sun Pluto to me is for sure the most kind of like intense magnetic. What like we're under his spell, we're powerless before him.
Yeah, it's like someone I feel like you, even if you're like not attracted to him, you meet in person, you're like, oh, I get it.
Yeah,
now.
And just that absolute concentration of Scorpio energy to me.
I'm afraid.
And that Venus in detriment. I don't like that, but I mean, we've seen it in the news. I'm sure he doesn't like it either.
Well, in with that conjunction of the Sun in Pluto and that squaring Saturn in Aquarius, but he, of course, early on, when it was early in his stand-up career and doing some of the roasts, famously part of his background origin story is that his father had died in the September 11th terrorist attacks. So it's like that's a little bit reflected in there in terms of some of the pain and stuff that he had surrounding that growing up. But then at the same time, later, for example, during roasts, that was one of the things that was unique, is like his ability to still embrace that and like allow there to be jokes about that and things like that, which seemed like dark or morbid, but it was an interesting example of like the strength and like resilience of somebody to like go on and have success and to move past a hard tragedy and still be a comedian and being able to be successul in that.
Yeah, very legacy oriented too, going back to like New York and firefighting. Then he made a movie, which we can talk off mic about that movie, but with featuring Bill Burr. But like going back to like who he is very at the meat of it all.
I think too with Scorpio Sun, it's he is pretty open about having been in rehab and using like illicit substances, and I think it's kind of that taking the darkness and bringing it to light kind of stuff, that openness that sometimes occurs. I think also obviously mysterious, drugs and stuff is something you hide often. So I think that's like an interesting observation.
I think also having that Neptune Uranus other people's projections, and also kind of capturing an ideal of like you said, the F boy of like, and also like sad, broken, whatever, and having that be your whole persona. And then how that then is like, well, if that's how everybody sees me, then I'm absolutely going to lean into that. If that's all I can be is this, and how that's also, it's potent and it is useful, but I think it also can be like tiring and degrading on him as a person too. And I think that it will be interesting to see like post Saturn return, when he maybe hopefully learns to like, I don't know, take care of himself in a better way, or like be more, I don't know, vulnerable, continue that streak of vulnerability, but in a maybe more like emotionally tender something kind of way. What am I learning about life? How am I beyond this thing? This is who I was up until this point, and I get to decide who I am now going forward and what my life is. I'm not just defined by how my dad died and all of the women that I've been with.
Julie, I never thought I'd hear you say something so beautiful about Pete Davidson.
Waxing poetic about
hey,
Davidson.
That's right. Mercury Scorpio.
I can't wait to see him grow up.
I can become the tender man. I am.
You're dickmatized.
Listen, your girl loves men. Okay. I always want the best for men. Okay.
So going back, really quickly, Lisa, what was the Eddie Murphy Saturn return thing?
Oh yeah.
He said on Mark Maron, and so we don't have like an exact date, but he stopped doing comedy at 27. There's a doc at the bottom that has just a bunch of info about him with dates. He definitely fathered his first children during his Saturn return and took a big gap from performing. And then again on Mark Maron said he was coming back to stand up. This is right before COVID happened. So he wasn't actually able to, but it would have been around the time of his second Saturn return. So I think it's interesting to like, take that big of a break, have this thing happen. He's getting on stage. People are yelling out, do this, do that. He's like, I don't want to do this anymore. And then, the Saturn cycle comes back and it's like, I think I want to try it again.
Like truly like one of the biggest stars in the world in his era. Like, did he have a Taurus midheaven too? I'm thinking of his like iconic, red jacket looks, like
fashion. Well, also has that Uranus and Leo, like Jim Carrey of that. I think just like star power and culture changing persona, where it's again, we're like both his stand up, but also starring in movies, and that, thinking of Leo movies. Leo being the very kind of like actor performer archetype too.
And he was so young when he did some of his biggest specials in the 80s. Like he was only in his like early to mid 20s or something, wasn't he?
Yeah. I do think that well, we talked about Bo Burnham too. I think that he has that, we call it the cap trap. I think that they're also, maybe it's something about youth and quickness too. I think that like Uranian influence there, but I think something that's interesting about Bo Burnham, and I think we see that then reflected in his Saturn return and Inside too, is that he's one of the first comedians who's been completely in control of his own like creation and distribution for all of his career, unlike other comedians, who was really able to capitalize on having ownership and kind of that like vertical monopoly on both the creation and posting, and then that being, I would say, absolutely indicative of why he is like a wonderkind rise to success.
Which is hilarious looking at this chart too, because we've talked so much about Mars, and then you just see this Taurus Mars like away from everything else, being like, and actually I'm gonna do it at my own pace.
Well, and you think of him singing and
voice.
Being mostly video, and not necessarily not that he's not a live performer, but he's not someone that you are like seeing out at clubs all of the time, that very much likes to create in an insular way on his own pace, doing his own things. He's also doing other people's projects, but I would say it's a much slower pace than say traditional stand-up.
I also think, Inside, I assume we've all seen it, I don't know, but it is just this, I can't go outside, you're coming inside. Like, you're going to see what's in here in my house. And it's like, whoa, okay. Like, that's such a quick solution. No one else came to that. Like, I don't know. I'm sure it took him a long time. I'm not saying he just like made it happen right away, but that is a huge piece of art.
Yeah, and that special Inside Out that he recorded during the pandemic and during the lockdowns, it was a great example of Saturn return, because it was very like introspective and like self-reflective, and that's a very common thing that you go through during the Saturn return, is like sometimes looking inwards and thinking about all of your flaws or all the parts where you don't meet up to a certain expectation or something like that, and you go through this phase, and then eventually sort of a dark night of the soul phase, and then eventually at the end of it you kind of emerge from it into this new 30-year cycle, having closed down the first 30-year cycle of your life. And I that reminds me, there was another Saturn return that was famously like that, which was Donald Glover, who has his Saturn in Scorpio, and he actually reminds me a lot of Bo Burnham's chart, because Bo Burnham has that Mercury in Virgo in the 10th house, and there's something about Mercury and Virgo sometimes, or very prominently placed Mercury, where they can have like many different skills or really excel in several different areas or several different fields. And Donald Glover certainly has that, where he has Virgo rising and Mercury on the ascendant in Virgo. And he's just somebody that has excelled and found success in like several different fields, in like comedy, in and in skit writing,
directing,
music,
directing, music,
acting.
What else? Yeah, so he's just like, it's like the modern like equivalent of somebody that's like not like a Renaissance man, maybe that's taking a little too far, but somebody that is skilled in like multiple different professions.
Well, I think it's interesting for both of them too, being people who were largely successful from a young age, to having a Saturn return where they're having to contend with not necessarily the way that I think a lot of people have their Saturn return, where it's like this is the first time that they are receiving kind of recognition or reaching some sort of pinnacle or getting to a next step. What happens when you have reached all this? Where do you go from there? And I think that often has to be very deep and like more personal as opposed to professional.
I think once they got so famous and palatable, I'm thinking of like Donald Glover with Community. It was Community, right? Like network star, and then being like, actually, here's the This Is America music video, and Atlanta is a very, it's like, it's high art. Like, it's like, no, don't, I can do this, and I can be very liked, but also like valuing that sort of art and not being so expected, or just like, you could easily just go on path and do so many corny roles, right? Like that's like, that he would have been like offer only, you know, like easy, sure, you got it. But he just like, oh, I have this base. Same with Bo Burnham with like 8th grade and like now directing all these other different things. It's like, oh, cool, I have the base, and now I can take this and do what I maybe really want to do. I'm making an assumption there. It's really what they want to do, but probably.
Well, and helping other comedians too, producing other people's work and being like, what else? I mean, I can make anything I want. What does someone else want to make that I can make possible with my star power?
Totally.
There can also sometimes during the Saturn return be a process of pulling back, like sometimes pulling back from society or disappearing a little bit, which is interesting, because I remember during Donald Glover's Saturn return, he sort of like disappeared off the radar for like 10 months or like a year or something, so that there started being articles written about like, why did he disappear and where is he and what is he doing? And then he suddenly like started posting on social media again, and he was posting all these like really introspective reflections and stuff. But one of them that he posted was, I hope people don't continue to judge me for some of the jokes or the bad skits that I did in the past, because he had some skits that were like YouTube skits with his comedy troupe originally that were like a little edgy at the time, but they like didn't age very well. And that's an interesting topic, just in terms of sometimes Saturn transits and people coming to terms with mistakes from the past and how they want to move forward after that. But it was like once he came back from that into the public light, then he dropped like one of his first albums, and then he really started becoming successful as a musician not long after his Saturn return.
I think that's a good.
Bo Burnham's Inside has that too. He has like an apology song, and definitely Eddie Murphy's Saturn return. That's his only gap. His first Saturn return and his IMDb, there's a gap. And I mean, some of the other stuff is voices and cartoons, not necessarily big picture, huge production films that he's starring in or anything, but that is like a gap. Of course, he had kids, you know, you have to at some point take time off, but Yeah, he has like a little gap there as well.
Yeah. I was going to say, I'm sure all these folks have stuff that did not age well at some point in their career in some way or another, just like most humans, because hopefully everyone's like learned and grown. But also when you have so much light on you and spotlight, I think it's really cool to even do that, to even like acknowledge like, yeah, the shit I made, that's like not really me anymore. And here's a new reintroduction to myself.
Many of us were fortunate enough to work out our early material in rooms where no one was recording anything and where it was just your fellow comedians. And I think now some people intentionally, like a Bo Burnham, who, put things on YouTube and were doing all of that, but so much stuff can be archived and saved and is dedicated to recording in some fashion, that I think this is going to be a trend we're definitely going to see for people going forward. And it is just something to consider, and not necessarily good or bad, but just a reality of the landscape now. Someone who has a Saturn return coming up is Chris Rock. Which I think cool. is interesting.
And with him, we have to be a little careful, because my friend Patrick Watson just told me today, because I wanted to use him, but there's some like question about his birth year, or there's some debate about it. It's probably still roughly going to be his Saturn return, but it's just something to be careful about, because there's some performers. This was an issue actually with Eminem as well, where sometimes when somebody's like really young, a group, their like managers will either put their birth year to make them older, or if they're a little bit too old for like the age group that they're marketing to. I think with Eminem, they said that he was actually younger than he was. So that's something to be aware of sometimes with like certain like birth data research.
Yeah, interesting. That makes sense with the entertainment industry in general too. I remember like Alexa Demi from Euphoria, maybe not a comedian, but had age was really blurry, and then people are like, I have the yearbook, I can prove that they graduated in this year.
I love that.
So one of the things that came up though was that's like, seems like it's just a constant thing now in any comedy podcast, or at least in certain comedy podcasts, which is in like the recent climate of a lot of the comedians are pushing for things like free speech, or seem to have a real thing about wanting to have the ability to be free to make jokes about anything or to say anything, and the ability to not have limits on comedy. And I've been trying to understand where that archetype is, if it's like a Mercury thing of just freedom to speak, if it's a Mercury Uranus thing in terms of like not wanting to be restricted or something, but it seems like it's a major discussion amongst comedians these days.
Do you mean that comedy is a spooky haunted house? Whitney Cummings said that on Twitter as a defense of free speech, that this is supposed to take you on a ride, kind of. I'm making it.
I thought Chris was going to pull up a clip of our podcast for a second. I was like, I'm getting scared. I was like,
like stand by this, yes or no? No.
And I was like, no. I'll go with the no. Are we talking about Rogan? We must.
I think it's honestly.
No, well.
I think it's more Saturnian, if I'm being honest. I don't know why I said it like that for this, but I think we have had Saturn in Saturn signs, and there have been real consequences for things people have said in a way that there never was before. And that is both by the format that has allowed people to exponentially grow their platforms, that now there are people that are seeing them and judging them that were not explicitly in an audience to see them or something, and there just are different consequences for what you're saying instead of an art form that has largely been, if you weren't in the room, you didn't hear it, and you could kind of get away with saying more outrageous things, or also this kind of I also think that there's this idea of it being like, we're joking, don't take anything seriously, but anything kind of taken out of context or seen something, not to say that that's right or wrong, but I think that comedy is not seen in the same context that it usually is, which was very much on purpose with an intended kind of audience, or like in the moment. And I think that that's that like Sag Gemini to me of like saying whatever you need to kind of like get what you need in that moment. That's very that. But I think that there's just consequence, and things are literally written and archived. That's very Saturnian to me, but also people saying like a kind of a scolding, I don't know, getting in trouble in this sort of way. And I think that it's less that comedy is like, people also still can say whatever they want. None of these people have been deplatformed. These people, in fact, have the biggest audience anyone has
they're making
had.
a ton of money.
Anyone has ever had at any time. It has never been more like lucrative to
free speech. You're not getting arrested.
Yeah.
You're not getting jailed.
Yes. If we want to talk about someone who like was free speech and wanted to stand for that, let's talk about George Carlin. These people that are talking about
Lenny Bruce,
Lenny Bruce,
it's like
people who literally got arrested for saying things on principle, for a thing, saying these are things that we are not allowed to say legally. They literally changed the legal system of the United States with their comedy. These are people that want to say things that like are being like, oh, you can't.
Trolls,
we can say we don't like what you say. Either make it funnier or don't say it.
So George Carlin's thing was he had a bit or an act about like the words that you're not allowed to say, and he got arrested for that at one point or something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. This was based on a Lenny Bruce being arrested for the same thing about 10 years prior. And I think George Carlin was there allegedly, like when he was arrested, but he said the 7 words you can't say on television. It's documented on a comedy album called Class Clown. And he was arrested at a live performance of this in a Milwaukee Summerfest.
I love Summerfest.
And yeah, so he performed, he opened.
Oh, the Wisconsinites were not having it. You know that for sure.
And he
Midwestern, I can say it, Midwesterners, they are barely saying heck, you know, so I imagine that really moved the needle. Shout out to anyone who's listening to the Midwest.
I don't even think he necessarily did the bit. He just was using profanity, and they said this was a family event, and so you can't do that. And so he was arrested, but it went on to be part of a Supreme Court case.
Wow.
Find this Pacifica Foundation, FCC versus Pacifica. And we like got there eventually. It took years, obviously, but like legal precedent was changed. His album is like in the National Archive for historical significance because these are the 7 words and it led to these landmark cases. It's still something that's like argued today. I think it actually is like maybe not even decided. There's several articles about this that I skimmed. I am badged through and through.
So that's interesting though, in terms of like the bounds of comedy and like what's permissible in a comedic context in certain times or places or cultures or time frames versus what's not. And also like the nature of what's in good taste being somewhat contextual, as well as I know even today there's different comedians, like it's sometimes remarked upon how Seinfeld prefers not to curse in his comedy, that he does like a quote unquote like a clean act in terms of not using curse words. And when asked about that once, one of the reasons he gave was he said that it felt too easy for him, that it's too easy to get a joke or a laugh out of a curse word, whereas it's much harder if you don't do that and use it as like a crutch, was part of his like rationale.
I was seeing Seinfeld live, and I wasn't a huge like fan or whatever. I watched the show. I know he's one of the greats. But I was blown away. He ran on stage, did an hour and a half and ran off. Like he had so much energy, and he was 61 when I saw him, and he made an effort to the first hour just be all Seinfeld style observation. And then the last half hour was a little bit more loose, still not profane in any way, still clean, but about his family and about observations within his personal life, which I thought was a really just a really fun thing to watch someone actually, oh yeah, you want to give me a challenge? Yeah, I'll take it. It's very Taurus.
I think
I'm curious where in the chart is his anti-hugging stance. He's very anti-hugging. There's a great clip of Kesha trying to give him a hug, and he's like, no. So right. I'm curious where his no touching policy, which we could talk about on a different level, but
I think he's so earthy to me, and I think there's like an efficiency in terms of like he works very hard, and admittedly in terms of like crafting jokes, working on that, and to have it be something that can then go from stage to screen, can be performed anywhere. Why would you kind of like adjust yourself? And that's also very Taurus to me.
Taurus too,
that,
yeah, my comfort.
Yeah,
a show about nothing.
His comfort level.
There was a quote too of something about like Taurus being simple and like
succinct.
Yeah, all of that. Where I think that is that whatever whatever you feel about cursing, it does elicit responses in people that's different than that. It is also distracting from the material potentially. Sometimes I think it's more punctuation and this, and it fits the comedian. But I think Jerry Seinfeld cursing, we'd all go like, no, we don't.
Well, and
like
also the money, like
Yeah.
you're gonna hit a wider
Yep.
audience if you can perform anywhere. Your material works in any space, and kids can understand it, and adults will also enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm saying he's like a children's
He's ready-
comedian by any
well,
means,
he's ready
but
to
he's
work.
financially it makes sense.
B
too.
movie is a kid's movie.
B
Yeah.
movie, good God.
He's ready to work, and that's very
ready to work.
Taurus to me too. Of that, where it's like this is stuff that works.
Mm-hmm.
So that brings up other things. Like one is like issues of like luck and fortune and timing, and sometimes people just being in the right place, in the right time at the right place, and being incredibly lucky, like Seinfeld to a certain extent, with just landing that show with Larry David, and the way that they were able to like get that and then become wildly successful and eventually have like the most popular show in Hollywood or on television. And then also other themes like when a person hits the peak of their career, or sometimes peaks, and there's people that are like widely like Seinfeld, for example, hitting the peak with that in the 1990s with his TV show and being like widely applauded, versus like sometimes it's interesting seeing a person like a comedian hitting the high point in their career and being the most successful or the most widely recognized, but also having some of the greatest hardships at that time. Like, for example, I think of like Carlos Mencia, who was accused of like joke stealing during that time, or Dane Cook, for example, who, even though he was selling out stadiums and stuff, like he was being kind of like heckled by other comedians as like not being good or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think part of it for Seinfeld, at least for me, and this came from my mouth and I heard it somewhere. So, but like I've heard that Larry David and Jerry won't sue people for the use of like the logo. Don't like go sue that. Don't go make a bunch of stuff because I said this.
No, make it in the style of the Astrology
But
Podcast, and
it's-
then
Oh
send
my
it to
God.
us.
But it's
yes.
this like they're cool about it. Where I think with Dane Cook, it's like he was so like very ego forward, and I don't think he would have let you use his image or anything like that. So maybe there is a bit of that happening. I don't know.
Sure. And with him, it was weird because sometimes there can be this alignment of like everything happening at once in a person's life. And with him, it was like he hit the high point of his career in terms of selling out audiences and making millions of dollars. But then in very quick succession, it's like both of his parents died, I think, in the same year.
Oh, wow.
And his brother ended up, who was his manager or business like accountant at the time, ended up ripping him off for like all of his money or for like millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And he ended up his brother went to prison as a result of that. And that ended
I
that
didn't know
relationship.
this. Can we see the chart?
Yeah, I'm trying to find it.
I gotta see this.
I know we don't. I was
now.
like, I know we don't have a birth time for him. I also think that something with Dane Cook, or maybe you do, Chris. I don't know your sources. I think Dane Cook also was like trying to be cool and a successful comedian too. And I think while you can be cool for being a comedian, I think that you can't also be like a hot celebrity too. Like you still are a clown at a certain point. And I think that Dane Cook was more like, I don't know, he was on like different red carpets and kind of in this more celebrity, which is I think also a symptom of the time that he was famous too. Like he can't help that. It was like peak tabloid kind of culture too. But I think he was more in the mix of, I think there's more hate about the echelon of society that he was allowed access to that comedians kind of aren't supposed to, that's getting like comedian hate. And then also kind of a higher position to be judged from. Whereas Seinfeld, is on a TV show playing Seinfeld, being kind of himself through and through, making tons of money, being successful, creating a great show. But he wasn't trying to then be like a hot heartthrob.
There's like a thirst. There's a thirst with Dane Cook that I think he knew exactly who, like if they said like jump, it's like how high, and whoever his base was very particular. And I don't think he had that wide reach that Seinfeld did have, being a way more,
and
neutral sort of party.
The other thing is that he actually, I think part of the criticism from other comedians with Dane Cook is that he came up way too quick, and he didn't go the traditional route. He didn't have to grind as much as other people
Well,
did,
Dane Cook also
because
was
he was one of the first comedians who really utilized social media, because
Mm-hmm.
he got
Say
into
MySpace, right?
he got into MySpace like really early on, and what he did is he had this really fascinating strategy of like adding just like hundreds and thousands of people onto his friends list. So he's one of the first really successful comedians to use social media to just like explode his following like very early on or very quickly, and that's why he was able to start like selling out all of these like Madison Square Garden and things like that through his use of social media. And then also he got a little bit of hate because he had more of like a physical comedy and his delivery style, where he was really, it was his mannerisms and his sort of like appearance and the way he would move on stage instead of just the jokes themselves. Sometimes it wasn't that it was a well-crafted joke, but it was like the way he delivered it was kind of unique or funny at the time.
Yeah. Can I say a secret on this podcast? I love Dan Cook's comedy.
Oh my God.
I loved it. And I think I would still love it.
I could quote so many Dan Cook bits.
I love
what was the hand thing?
The Sufi?
Yeah.
This or this? I don't know. It might be
it's something
I was like, it's this.
It's that, yeah.
It was very teen boy.
Yeah.
Well, which also as a teen girl at the time loved, because I was just like, yes, I want to be around this shocking sort of like it's almost like Bart Simpson-y, but like way more extreme.
So to be fair, he also like was, I don't want to say he was cool, but he was cool in a young pop culture kind of way, which is something that people always dismiss and say isn't as important, again, versus say a Seinfeld, who is like,
wasn't cool,
adult friendly, institutionally recognized there. I do know that Dane Cook has this Mercury Uranus opposition, I think Aries Libra, which to me I think is interesting, thinking about like, it's not fair that he got this thing, instead of it being like, oh no, he was an innovator in this way and took advantage of the platform afforded him via MySpace, that anybody could have done it. I also think that's like an argument to make for anybody, where it's like, if you could have been Dane Cook, you would have been Dane Cook.
Right. So that was that Mercury. So he has Mercury at 15 Aries opposite to Uranus at 17 Libra. And I think that's both relevant in terms of his use and like leveraging of technology, but also on stage, like his quick sort of like jerky movements and mannerisms remind me of that as well with that placement.
And he's extreme. Taurus moon. It's so interesting to compare him to Seinfeld with the Taurus sun.
Like, well, no, he's a Pisces now. I'm like, oh, okay.
Well, understand. I mean, he did have like his voice. It's that it's not necessarily the traditional comedy voice. Again, I think that Mercury and Aries kind of being quick, being childlike, if you will, not childlike, but appealing to young people. And yeah, I mean that Neptune Saturn opposition too, of that like being the kind of in that Gemini Sag, again, to me that also would be like, oh yeah, not getting the kind of approval that he would want from comedy writ large, being an outlier that way. But and I also think that Jupiter in detriment again is that like super successful, but not necessarily not necessarily for the thing that you want, or having something be highlighted and it's your climbiness, it's your willingness to be the biggest instead of the respect that you want.
And then your brother just takes all your money.
Yeah.
While you're not looking. That's wild.
Yeah.
What a tale.
So that's a whole thing. And that just brings up, because sometimes it's interesting listening to comedy podcasts nowadays, because you hear not just about reflections on like jokes and different eras in the person's career and how they put together bits, but also sometimes their personal lives and how that's run in parallel or influence different periods of their career. So Dane Cook, that brings up another thing of just like differences between comedy styles of things like physical comedy and delivery, and like other types of stand-up comedians like that who use like, there's for example like Carrot Top, for example, who used like prop comedy, and that being like a genre. Or there's others, I know in our notes one of you mentioned like Gallagher, who would like smash like watermelons and stuff. So that's a whole other sort of genre as well, of like physicality versus like something that, let's say, is like just a highly intellectual joke or something like that.
Yeah.
I think it's all going to be a matter of like what haters are going to hate, I guess is the thing. It's like maybe it is not traditional stand-up comedy, but again, it's like a tool that someone decided to use.
I mean, no,
successful.
No one's ever going to say that Lucille Ball isn't a comedian and she wasn't a stand-up intellectual like that she was a clown. She was a different type of comedian. And I think it is interesting to see. I think there are people that process externally. And I think Gallagher is a great example of like smashing something outside. And there are people like Robin Williams who like, you know, had issues with substance abuse and like destroy internally, you know what I mean? And you don't see that necessarily as easily. They're not similar like stylistically at all, but I just think that, you know, that is a process for some people.
Here's Lucille Ball's chart.
Wow. Yeah. Leo's sun,
hair.
Moon, and then that Uranus and Capricorn as well. And I mean, Mars with Saturn.
Cap rising for a model, you know.
She's got a lot of Earth placements, just like the Moon, Uranus, Mars, Saturn, Mercury, and Venus, all distributed between Capricorn and Taurus and Virgo. And there's just something about Earth signs and the notion of like physicality or materiality that I think is really relevant.
Well, she also was such a pioneer in like they created television technology for her for their show. They owned a studio. Even the day in, day out kind of like performance level of her starting in radio, and then the sitcom itself is such a like grinding output schedule.
They changed the way we record sitcoms. I mean, that's pretty phenomenal.
Yeah. And then also just the scope of her success in terms of the show itself being super successful to me is very earthy in like measurable numbers, money, influence. It's not like she wasn't like a critical darling. Not to say that she wasn't critically acclaimed as well, but it was like, oh no, this is like butts in seats.
I mean, talk about pioneering, you know, we still like struggle to find diversity in film and television today. And like we had an interracial marriage on stage. Like that is incredible, you know?
And very much like her and being like, this is my real, like we're performing together. It's where you get us both or we don't do this, period.
Ride or dies.
Right. That brings up a really important point, which is comedy, especially stand-up comedy for a long time was like a male dominated field, and to some extent still is, versus women breaking into that field. And I know partially we can see a result of that just searching through Astro Databank for timed birth charts. I can see that we have just like way more timed charts for men than we do for women. But I don't know if there's any other women that maybe we should mention. I mean, one I wish we had a birth time for is Whitney Cummings, who unfortunately we don't have a birth time for, but is a really good example of a stand-up comic that's become very successful over the past decade in that field. And and maybe just glancing at the chart really quickly, if we could talk about maybe some of the reasons for that.
Yeah. And I'm going to, before I forget too, if we have Ali Wong, I would love to see, because I'm curious about like the pregnancy stand-up of her sort of life, but we might not have the time. I don't think there's
a rising, but we do have a chart.
But we can go back to Whitney, but I just wanted to say that before I forgot about Ali Wong, because she's also, I just saw that trailer for Beef that looks so good. Like I'm excited to see that she's kind of back after a divorce and, you know, back at it. But yeah, I saw something.
Whitney has that. Well, I was gonna say that zero degrees Sagittarius to me is very much like a moment in capturing something and having a quick ascent to. And I think that that's something that, you know, people are always going to criticize how women achieve anything. But I think that too, of it being, there's something too about it being like a show with her name and that same kind of, that like broad, big idea sort of thing.
I like the Scorpio stuff. I think with Scorpios in comedy, we see a lot of other people's stuff. We see a lot of like Ben Bailey, Cash Cab, like other people's money. We see Russell Peters, like joke theft conversation, things like that with Scorpio. And I think for Whitney, we can see it in, she's a Scorpio rising. I'm sorry, I forgot the degree.
Noon chart, but she does have Mars and Jupiter in Scorpio.
Mars and Jupiter in Scorpio. And I think being on Chelsea's show, on Chelsea Lately on E, I think definitely helped her rise to success. And I think, I don't know, I could see Scorpio as also being kind of talking about those more feminine topics a little bit. But she does it in that Mars cutting way. Like she's not soft and, you know, cutesy when she talks about stuff, but it is those things of kind of talking about women's stuff or whatever, the taboo of discussing pop culture and those things.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think she doesn't look, not to say like she looks like not what you're going to hear, but there is that Scorpioness of like, oh, I'm going to overturn the rock and show you the bugs and the weird stuff, even though she has this, just seeing her Leo Venus with the Leo midheaven too, like it's like she gives like a pageant energy, like she's very like polished and pretty and like put together, and then you're like, oh, you're weird. Which I think is, you know, men hate that typically. So
she was a model too before comedy, or like
I was gonna say she's like
simultaneously at that. Yeah, but I think that that's also another thing too that's like you know, can be partially a benefit to success, because people will be like, oh, you're a beautiful person, we want to put you on TV, of course you belong on TV. But that also is a thing that makes it harder then to be taken seriously as a comedian, or be oh, we don't, what makes us even more mad when you're talking about something awful or taboo or whatever, or criticizing. And I think that Virgo sun too, I think that hearing someone as critical of anything, especially coming from a beautiful woman, is not something that people love.
Yeah. I know too that when her show aired, she was grieving a parent. I'm not exactly sure like when the parent died in relation to the show. I don't know if it was during filming or at the release of the show, but that is another example of those like outward, inward, maybe like a Saturn moment type of thing.
I think too with Virgo, I feel like they've been like the underrated champ across the research, because I do think it's natural go to Gemini, the Mercury of Gemini, and quickness and silly. But then Virgo does just have that that natural. We did it on our latest podcast. What was the book that was like, to love a Virgo is to let them worry, and just to like allow them to observe how everything is awful, and then they can like regurgitate that back to you, because it's very humanizing. Because it's like, oh, I feel that way too. Like climate change stresses me out as well. Like these are things that are universal stressors, or maybe sometimes it goes back to something a little more individual of their personal experience. But I think Virgo is, I'm just going to pitch them as the underrated champ of the comedy world universe that I've seen so far in this research.
Critical of how things work, systems work. Yeah. But also critical, I think self-critical in that way too. That's very indicative of comedians, of being able to notice your own flaws, talk about your own problems, talk about what like,
I know I look like this, but
having kind of an accurate assessment of yourself, but also being able to turn that into something funny that people can enjoy. I think that is very Virgo.
I did a show with Whitney, and she afterwards, I mean, I was brand new in comedy. I should have no business, you know, and I was like, oh, you're so funny. And she was self-deprecating. I mean, she wasn't super like, I hate myself or anything like that, but she was like, really? Like, oh, thanks. Like she wasn't, she was self-critical. She was not like, oh my God, I'm great. Like,
that's something that comes through a lot in her podcast, that she is very aware of her like flaws. And I think that's coming from the Sun and Virgo placement. But she also, with that really strong Mars in Scorpio with Jupiter, I think that gives her more of the drive and the ambition, and also the willingness to like go there with certain topics, or to put herself forth and be assertive in a way that probably has helped her, despite it being more, especially let's say 10 or 20 years ago, of a male dominated field, to find success and to like, I don't know, fit in or find a place for herself in comedy.
Totally.
I'm glad you mentioned Chelsea Handler too, because I think especially with the recent news post she did of being a happy childless woman, which, you know, you can Google this yourself if you want to go on this deep dive. But yeah, just like a good mention of a person that's still really shaking people up in terms of.
She's the full moon on the Pisces Virgo axis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she's and she's a Virgo rising too.
Yeah, so we actually have a birth time for Chelsea Handler. And just describing the chart, she has Virgo rising with the moon conjunct the degree of the ascendant at 5 Virgo.
Wow.
Opposite the sun at 6 Pisces, and then the ruler of the ascendant is Mercury in Aquarius at 11 degrees. And it's kind of broadly squaring Uranus at 2 degrees of Scorpio. And I think that's kind of interesting. She's like willing to go there and like kind of rile people up sometimes.
Yeah, and Saturn absolutely. Cancer too, with the just back to that recent childless thing with Cancer Saturn being like, and fuck all of you, like we're because of this. And I think too, like even her rise to fame was really controversial because wasn't she like dating an executive who literally gave her a slot, and she was like, yeah, I did, I slept my way to the top. Who cares?
I believe so.
I did
at least there's a story of that. I don't know, whatever.
And I say it without any judgment. Like she was like, yeah, I slept with the right person. It works out that way sometimes.
I mean, I also remember during that time frame in the late 2000s also, she would do spots on like on E, I think on the E network. She would do little bits and like they were really funny. Like she was really good at really quick, biting kind of comedic humor that fit that format really well, where you have to say something like really witty in a very short span of time. And I think it was through that that she started getting more prominence through doing those slots on TV and then eventually getting her own show and everything else.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think those like short essays too, she had all of those books like Are You There, Vodka, It's Me, Chelsea, and that kind of again, that like self-deprecating, I'm sharing my own, I'm a mess. That Virgo Pisces, like I can talk about me being a mess, so you don't have to.
It's like it's fabulous,
it's funny,
mess.
And I'm aware of it, and I'm having a great time, and I'm living my life, doing what I want, and you can too. Like it's okay to be a mess, and it's hilarious.
She's like the really first goblin mode person, or like the embracing of like goblin energy.
That's interesting that you mentioned that because I just did the Pisces episode last month, and Austin Kopic, who's a Pisces, he said that one of the things he associates with Pisces is like the messy genius. And he mentioned both like Einstein as well as like Rihanna as examples of that. So it's interesting that you bring that up here.
Yeah, she definitely like skis naked. That she's just always like smoking weed on Instagram or whatever.
Yeah,
I also think that 7th house sun and like partnerships. We know all of her, like who she's dated. We know all of her. Her brother has been on her show. Like we know, and I guess that's the Saturn Cancer stuff too, where it's like we know her dogs. We know her like. She lets us know her partnerships.
I think that's also a very mutable, a mutable quality too, which is like obviously changing from moment to moment, but it is just like the essence of somebody. It's that thing that you kind of can't pin down. It's not necessarily, it is her ideas, but it's also the way that she delivers them, and it's also just like the way that she lives and exists and is, and that's very mutable to me.
I have a pitch pivot, which let me know if y'all are open to this.
But
the chart of Saturday Night Live launching, because I think that that's just been such a constant staple in comedy and like who's come out of SNL. So I know we've been talking mainly about people's charts, but I don't know if we want to look at an actual show. Sure, we don't have to, but
what's the data?
It's on Astro. Let me pull it up here. I can, I'll put it in our chat here.
I think too,
but it's October 11th, 1975, 11:30 p.m., when it always comes out in New York, New York.
It's October 11th, 1975. When?
At 11:30 at night in New York City.
Interesting fact, George Carlin, first host of SNL.
Oh,
again, wow. Once again, very Uranian, very like on the precipice of a lot of cultural relevance, and a lot of his clips have been reshared. He has Uranus and Taurus natally, and then with this most recent move of Uranus and Taurus, there's been a lot of resharing. Oh, we're still dealing with these same things. This is still relevant.
Eddie Murphy too went back to host SNL in his second Saturn return after leaving, so that's another SNL story.
Yeah, and like when I was looking up SNL stuff, there's a lot of articles and debate on which era is the best, and everyone is like the first 5 years are like number one. And then of course we had like the 90s Renaissance. And I thought it was really interesting because I think Julia referenced earlier when we had that what we call the cap trap, the cluster of Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune too, is when we had Chris Farley's first premiere in September 29th, 1990. And I just thought it's interesting because we had Lorne Michaels go away for a bit and then came back and then talked about how he was basically, this is a quote from the Chris Farley documentary. I think it's called I Love Chris. I have it written down somewhere, but it was basically said that he was like Dan Aykroyd and John Belushi had a baby, or it's a child they didn't have. So then this sort of like second coming and fitting a new generation. And it's, you know, SNL still, just the endurance of SNL is just kind of wild for like, I don't know what the longest show is in general. Maybe Simpsons. No, I mean, SNL must be at this point. This has been on so long.
Yeah. So that brings up, and also Lorne Michaels, the sort of showrunner, has been in charge of it so for so long, and he's been sort of like a unspoken kingmaker of comedy through either, you know, having people on or not having people on, and has made so many careers as a result of that, of different comedians.
Yeah, I was just saying too, with like looking at Jupiter and Aries in the 10th house for the chart of SNL is just like breakout stars as well. It feels very in that solo Aries way. And then even I think this Gemini Mars in the 12th of like movies and spinoffs, if we think of the 12th house as maybe the screen or a medium or something like that, there seems to just, I like that it's also Mercury retrograde for the launch. Is kind of interesting.
Fourth house and in the home.
Yeah.
Like we're watching it live from home. And I feel like that was a new, maybe I'm not sorry to say I'm not old enough to know if it was new, but it feels like it might have been new.
I think too that like, you know, I of course go to Uranus and Scorpio, and it being kind of like not for prime time sort of thing. This being stuff that it's late night. It's this with that also with that Scorpio North node of this being sort of taboo stuff. This is more critical. This isn't, I don't know. And also, I don't know, laughter in there too. I think
and
is
the cat
very,
moon.
Yeah. The cat moon. I mean, that to me is the enduring quality there. But even that Uranus and Scorpio too, of like staying, I don't know, fixed in the culture, changing the culture, and then becoming a part of it, and being a place where you kind of go to see what, I mean, I don't think this is how we would describe SNL now, as again, a long running program on a major network that is largely successful, is not necessarily taboo or cutting edge the same way that it was when it started. But I think when it started, it established itself as a thing that we were going to see things that you wouldn't see anywhere else on TV, that you were going to see artists, musicians, comedians. We were going to be talking about subjects that you weren't talking about anywhere else, and kind of seeing that on network is pretty radical.
You didn't get to always see it like
and
12 of the funniest coked up people, you know, gather in one cinema and screen
and even
space.
The idea, I think, of that Jupiter and Aries of it being live performance. This is happening live. You can see the mistakes. You can see this too. This isn't like a cut, edited, scripted. I mean, it is scripted, obviously, but
yeah.
I mean,
well, now the digital bits are so much more prominent now too. The pre-recorded sort of stuff where I don't even like, I think it was Leo Saturn was in the second house too, which also feels kind of like a sustainable moneymaker.
That reminds me also, go ahead.
The Jenny Slate F-bomb moment is really loaded too. I mean, there's so much happening. We don't have to take a look, but if as an Easter egg, if people want to, it's insane to look how much is happening, not just in the sky, but actually happening in transit to her natal chart. It's wow.
So we have that might be a good subtopic. So we have a birth time for Jenny Slate. What was the date of the event you're talking about?
Let me get the exact September for sure.
26.
Also, we need to paywall these notes. Like this doc is just like off the charts. I can't wait to read through.
This could be a book or something. The amount of different comedians and birth times and everything that you three compiled.
Oh, it's September 26th, 2009.
And also, I'm writing that down, Chris. This is the we heard it first. The astrology comedy book. Don't steal our idea. We're posting this out. We say this all the time. And then we give away business ideas. Like,
I'm not sure if you do 8 o'clock when it airs, or if you. I don't know how exactly.
Well, I thought 11:30 is air.
11:30 Eastern for sure.
I don't know if they still do it at 11:30. Do they? Oh, I didn't know that. Okay,
I think sometimes it will change depending on like if it's like a Oscars week or like little things, but.
Okay, so here is Jenny Slate's chart. Set up the context. What is the event we're talking about?
So she famously, there's this sketch and she is having to say the word friggin' a lot. And it's kind of her personality. It's the character trait, the funny part of her character. And she slips the F word.
This is also her premiere
her first night ever. Yeah. And you see her face and she kind of goes like, and then she blows her cheeks out and then it cuts away from her. But you know, she could tell in the moment that she effed up literally, and they cut away, and you know, I'm sure she's heartbroken.
Also only had one season on SNL, and it is not said that she was fired because of this reason. But definitely that led to speculation of going, okay, this is like not a strong first episode, and it's not surprising that she did not go on to stay with SNL and have one of those SNL careers that we know are
there were also precedents, I think, of other performers having cursed on accident and losing their position, not for that reason. They're obviously, they don't say it's for that reason. And Jenny Slate has gone on to have a storied career, so I think it's an easy example because she just was Oscar nominated twice. She's doing fine. But I do think it's just such a huge moment, and of course for the viewer to be like, whoa, she did it.
Right, because so it's on network television, so she can't use curse words. They were supposed to use like a euphemism, and that I think SNL can actually get fined like lots and lots of money when a performer does accidentally slip up, especially because it's done live and it can't be edited out. So here's her chart on the inner wheel with her transits on the outside, and what's the key thing that we're looking at, or just describe it for the audio people?
Let's see. Well,
I mean, I think it's this
Mars on the ascendant,
right on her
right on the ascendant.
So her ascendant's at 16 degrees of Cancer, and transiting Mars is at about 19 degrees. So it's passing right over there, and it's actually interesting because you can see the transiting Moon on the other side at 14 degrees of Capricorn. So there was a forming Moon-Mars opposition that night. And she also has the North Node at 19 degrees of Cancer. So Mars was exactly conjoining it.
Yeah. And then the nodal opposition happening too on the South Node transiting her North Node, vice versa, since the nodes are traveling in duos too. That just feels a little bit like, whoops. Like, I don't know. It just feels like a sort of time portal.
Okay.
Jupiter, conjuncting her natal Venus at 17 degrees of Aquarius, a big oopsie.
And then the 8th house,
and also with Neptune out of orb, but you know, it's hanging out nearby, so a little bit of missing something.
Sure.
Yeah.
It looks like it's funny, like Mercury was retrograde at that time, so there's a Mercury retrograde element to it, and her natal Saturn's at 20 Libra, so transiting Mars was squaring that. If the transiting nodes are moving through her first and seventh house, that means she was having eclipses for an entire year and a half time frame during that time frame. So this was kind of must have been a huge break for her getting cast on SNL and being on it and having that sort of prominence during that time frame. But eclipses can have, like we said earlier, that sort of chaotic energy sometimes of major beginnings and major endings. And we see transiting Uranus, for that matter, was like going right over
on her midheaven.
Yeah.
Also, the sun opposite sun square Pluto on the descendant too at that 0 degrees. Capricorn to me is very like institutional retribution, like reaction. Right. And also just that, like, I don't know, her son, like
Uranus was up on the midheaven.
Yeah,
too.
like, yeah.
So that's really. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. It feels like, and this is like true assumption hour, but I'm wondering too, because I think Uranus was in Pisces, like up on her midheaven. And it feels like, I wonder if she was beating herself up more than maybe everyone else was. And maybe it's like a headspace to even, that's hard.
Sure.
I'm truly speculating, like, we'll never know unless, Jenny, if you hear this, let us know what was happening on this.
Think about rehearsing that scene over and over where you're going like, I get it, it's supposed to be this. I get it, it's supposed to be this.
Yeah.
Don't F
just
up.
don't do
F
this
up,
one
don't
thing.
F up,
yeah.
Don't F up. And then it's like the word is in the thing. It's too much.
Well, and with Virgo, it was Virgo Mercury too, retrograde, back to some Virgo-ness of the precision being a little undone in a retrograde time.
Yeah. So that's really good. So there can sometimes be like singular pivotal moments in a comedian's career, for better or worse, And that could be a whole study in and of itself, is just studying the transits of those moments in time in order to understand the broader context of when a person's life changes or when something really important happens and what the nature of that was. And that, of course, like makes me think of like a year ago when one of the most like notable things happened, which is when Will Smith got up at the Oscars and like slapped or almost punched Chris Rock for telling a joke. And then some of the things that have like come out of that since that time. So that's another instance of something that where you would want to like study it, or it's been studied and talked about a lot in terms of both Chris Rock's chart as well as especially like Will Smith's chart.
Look, Will Smith's just not a comedy fan, you know. That's, we display that in various ways, and his was a little more Martian.
Yeah,
you know, I was gonna say Will Smith has also had a long comedy career. Also, wild that he went on to give a Best Actor winning speech after, like all of that moment is just a truly iconic.
Yeah, well, that was really wild because it was a good example because he was having extremely positive transits and extremely negative transits all at the same time. And that was a perfect example of that, of somebody literally hitting the height of their career, of something he's been striving for decades at that point, to win an Oscar and reach the highest point in his chosen career field as an actor, especially doing dramatic roles, and in which he'd made multiple shots at that in the past, and those roles hadn't been recognized. But then at the same time, to do something, to like commit an action at the same time that kind of like ruins it, like simultaneously. It was a really interesting study in terms of what that looks like to have simultaneously good transits and bad transits.
Yeah, you just don't see celebrities often lose it like that too. So it was just, it felt very throwback to like an early aughts when people didn't feel as monitored, or social media. It was almost like being transported just like a different era, even. Not to say that punching at the Oscars happened like before, but there's just felt something very like like it was only them in this room, which I think is just also was so wild about the slap.
Right. Well, it also brought up a lot of issues for comedian, because at least it seemed like most of the comedians were outraged because it broke a line in comedy of the comedians want to be able to tell jokes and that you're not allowed to like assault somebody for a joke.
Right.
And then fears surrounding whether that would like open the floodgates to like other comedians getting assaulted. And for example, whether a few months later somebody jumped up at a Dave Chappelle show and tried to attack him, and whether that was partially like based on or had anything to do with the precedent being set with the Will Smith incident and everything else.
I think that there is also, we talk about the fourth wall in performance, and not just in comedy and drama. And I think everyone present at the Oscars knows that exists. And so it's an invisible barrier that we've all agreed is there, but maybe that's very Neptunian or something, but crossing that feels like a intentional thing. I know I recently performed at a comedy club that had the wands, the metal detector wands, and just was going through it's a large club, and I was just it made me feel so much safer. And I never knew that was something I wanted or cared about, but it's like, it's just so interesting with, the way violence these days. So, there are making changes in order to like protect performers.
I just say tell better jokes. You might not catch some hands if
I think they're
joking.
They're also in the Oscars specifically, I think it's a little bit different than in an audience where there is a different kind of power dynamic between performer and audience. And whereas at the Oscars, I think everyone is kind of a peer in a way, and not to say that anyone is right.
Yeah, it's like a work event.
Yes, but that where it's like it's
a very sober work event where you're like, oh my God, this just went down. And then also not to like, the context of Jada with hair loss, like it was just like, it was the perfect storm of, and then of course Jada and Will have a very public, unique relationship. So it was just the perfect storm. And then the fact that Chris Rock just continued was also very speaking to the entertainment industry of like, and don't acknowledge something very wild that just actually happened to you. So, and now they have crisis teams. They did also change how the Oscars works now. They have like, I don't know what the crisis team does. I guess they wear jackets that say if something like that happens again, we'll do something, because no one did anything. And I think that was the other very strange part of the whole ordeal.
Well, it's a surreal. I mean, you don't know too, like, was this planned? Was this
right?
Is this part of the bit? And I think everyone was like, wait, what is happening?
Yeah,
right.
It was shocking.
But I think that, like Lisa said too, it's good that they're taking safety precautions for people, because that just is a reality of the world that we live in now, where there is more, it seems like more kind of danger in public spaces, not necessarily just for comedians, but for anybody. And to be aware of each other's fragility as humans and all of our mental and physical well-being, and wanting to like protect that, I think is a net positive. I don't think that everyone is going to be Chris Rock getting slapped, but I also think that to say that there isn't also, I don't know, increased response to people's words is also not true.
Well, and a fun fact, don't know if it's fun at all, but the Oscars, because of COVID, that was the first time I think ever they had it in Aries season. It's normally in Pisces and Aquarius season. It can flip flop in like early February, but it was later. I don't think we can pull it up, but I know it was
March
like
27th.
It was in primetime Aries season. So that's like also kind of unique if we get into Aries stereotypes of back to Mars. Yeah.
And I know we don't know Chris Rock's chart, but he did have Mars conjunct his sun in the chart that we do have for him on the Oscars day.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can pull it up.
The stars are saying, Chris, brace thyself.
Well, and then he did his live event almost like a year exactly after. And I think that that's like an interesting response to another live event. They're having a live performance of comedy as kind of like taking back your power, so to speak, or showing your prowess as a live performer, both in that instance when you had to handle something you weren't expecting, and also going, here's how good I am when I am trying to perform.
Imagine an Aries, the end of that live performance, and the way he spikes that microphone.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that was and there was so much buildup because everybody wanted to know. Everyone knew Chris Rock would eventually like address this in his stand-up, and everyone wanted to know like what he was going to say. And he was quiet for many months, and he didn't say anything publicly. So there was so much anticipation built up to that special when they finally live streamed it just like a month ago or in the past month. And then at the very end he has like it was like 5 or 10 minutes where he talked about the Will Smith thing finally.
Yeah, I think all we knew right away was that they weren't going to get into lawsuit mode. He was like, we're like, it's fine. Like I say air quotes, it's fine. And then then the buildup of Chris Rock's chart. Yeah,
so it's again not for sure, but this is like the best we think it is we think it's like February 7th, 1965. I'm not sure if this time is where this comes from. I don't remember offhand, but this may roughly be the chart. And it's interesting. One of the things I was thinking about when he did that special is like it was right about the time Saturn, I think, was about to go into Pisces or did go into Pisces, and he just began his second Saturn return right now.
Yeah.
There also was I want to say Mercury was in Pisces as well. Hang on, what's my note about this? Mercury was in Pisces when he recorded the transiting Mercury, and it was opposite his Uranus-Pluto conjunction, I want to say. And one of the things that he noted about that is that he flubbed a punchline. And I just think Mercury in Pisces, where it's not as strong, he has natal Mercury in Aquarius, as we've noted for several comedians, which is, Mercury's exalted there and it's very strong, and he's very deliberate with his words and really establishes his premises, and will often like repeat himself, which I think is very like Mercury in Aquarius, that fixed, like, this is the idea we keep coming back to, I'm going to say it over and over and over again so what I'm talking about, and kind of variations on that theme. But then having that Mercury in Pisces transiting, having it be a little bit more loosey-goosey, not for the whole special, obviously, but that like when the emotion kind of kicks in, and when he's dealing with this subject matter that's a little bit more, that we're all waiting for.
That was tough that he flubbed like his main joke at the very end of the set about
on a
Will
live
Smith.
taping.
I felt really bad for him.
But then that to me speaks to like the Saturn return starting too, of it being like coming back to performing and establishing himself again as like one of a prolific performer, and also that being part of the live performance. That's the risk that you run when you are proving yourself as a live performer that so many people are not doing in their stand-up for good reason. But having that be like, yeah, that is something that can happen because it's live and I'm showing you that this is happening in real time, warts and all.
That's really interesting because that reminds me then Saturn was in Pisces in the mid 90s. So his first Saturn return must have been him. Some of those specials in the 90s that became so popular of his that really put him on the map must have happened around that time period.
Totally.
Yeah.
All right.
Wow.
Well, all right. So we're about 2 hours into this recording, and I could keep talking. I could keep going on, but I know you each have like some time restrictions. Is there anything we wanted to talk about or that we'll be kicking ourselves that we didn't mention, or any example charts that you want to throw out really quickly?
Great. I don't know why. Maybe it's just because his name popped in and I feel like he's legendary and now I'm just curious, but I think we might have lightly mentioned Richard Pryor. I feel like also had a very, wild life and story, but I don't know if we want to dig into like one more chart before we wrap it. I mean, we'll just have to come back and chat comedy some more because there's just so much juicy stuff to dig into.
Right.
I think he does have a good example chart of kind of all of the sort of signatures that we've been talking about, which is like the tension of the opposition, but also these tight conjunctions of planets, including Mercury, Uranus, and Venus, Mars.
Yeah, I was going to say, do we have a thesis we're stating? Like,
yeah,
all right,
I can bring it up if we have specific things that we want to say about it. Here it is. But I'm just
curious if there's any like through line from a lot of the stuff that we've talked about which of course there is.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
So
just with like Mercury, I think this Mercury with in Scorpio with Mars and Venus, especially Richard Pryor. I mean, where did grew up? Like, correct me if I'm wrong too. Like, grew up, I think in mom was a sex worker. Grew up in a prostitution house. Lit himself on fire in his drug addiction, but also like I feel like been through the depths, but then also can bring it back in this funny way somehow, like things that would probably destroy the average person, but can turn this into this very lovable jokester, right? I think I saw some like Taurus placements too with if we can pull it back up.
I would say he's also largely responsible for, or what someone might disagree with this, but I would say that the like comedy material as personal material, personalizing, talking about yourself and your life and your upbringing as your subject matter, I think is something that he really innovated that people weren't doing before. And while even someone who I would say another like kind of greats in the conversation, like a George Carlin, is still talking about ideas and social structures and, these kind of big picture things. And I think Richard Pryor is really talking about his personal experience. And I think that Venus Mars conjunction opposite Jupiter Saturn and that Scorpio that you talked, Scorpio Taurus of like what's nice versus like what's true and what's beneath all of that is very Richard Pryor. And he also has that Sag Gemini Virgo square, like not in the same personal planets there, but just like in his chart, I think for being like a comedian defining comedian.
I think too, I mean, the roast of Richard Pryor is one of, I feel like I see it playing in bars sometimes, like I think people love that. Talking about Scorpio energy and roasting earlier, he has Mercury in Scorpio. And I know, Julia, you also share this placement. It's something that you're very talented in doing, even though it's not necessarily, you're not like always a roast battler or whatever. Like when I have something I need to write, like if I need a roast joke, I'm coming to you. Like, you have such a talent for that. And so I do think Mercury Scorpio definitely in response to something, which I think roasting often is like at you, at me or whatever. And I think Scorpio is known for that kind of responsive, especially in a Mercury position. I find that interesting.
What's wild to think about Scorpio, especially with Scorpio Mercury, is roasting or dragging someone or hitting them where it hurts is going below the belt, but then also making that below the belt not where you are like, that was just too mean, like that didn't work. You want to find what's below the belt, which is very Scorpio with the genitals and blah blah blah, sexual sort of things, and then bringing it back into something that's like palatable too. So
there's like an invisible line of like you go low, but not like too low.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because this is like, I had Jeff Ross's chart, which we have a noon chart. We don't have a birth time, but he has this Mars Neptune conjunction in Scorpio. And he sometimes, it seems like he's successful in finding, like, roasting is his thing. And he had a podcast at one point about roasting, as well as developing a formula that West Coast comedians used for doing roast battles that then started being emulated in the New York comedy scene at one point. And finding that right balance, I think, between like something low that is like hitting a spot that's true, because I think that's part of it about roast, is that sometimes it's hitting something that's actually true, and it's getting the bottom of something in a comedic way, but it's also hitting that right note that's not like too low or is not too distasteful or what have you.
It's about knowing your opponent too, which I think is a very Scorpio way to approach a fight or any sort of thing.
Totally doing your
when
research.
you have to in a roast battle too, you have to be able to both like attack and defend, have comebacks for knowing what someone else might say about you. And I think that that's a very Scorpio introspective, knowing your own flaws and shadow self, and this is what someone else might use against me.
Right, that's great. So knowing your own weaknesses just as much as you know the others, and therefore also being able to like sidestep or defend yourself if you know your weaknesses in some extent, versus not having that self-knowledge.
And how well you're able to like maintain while being attacked in that way too, of saying like when someone is saying the potentially most, not necessarily shameful, because I think a lot of it again is like personal appearance and that sort of thing, but can you hold your head high and not only endure those things but also come back and say like, I might be this but you're also this, and like at least I'm not that. People
lose roast battles for having a reaction. It happens, and that's definitely something. Trying to keep it even, that's tough.
So
I'm thinking of someone like, this is just like an aside tangent again, maybe for another pod, but I'm thinking of like someone like Jimmy Fallon, who always breaks. Like Scorpio is very opposite energy, and God, if he has tons of Scorpio placements, then we can talk. But I'm just thinking of that would not work well for a roast, is like, you gotta like keep like not break every time someone says something about you. Even though that's totally his style, is that like he broke, like he's so endearing and is like always laughing at himself.
I do think he's
the opposite. Go ahead.
Scorpio moon, so maybe it's that.
Afraid to go.
And the opposite is like the just blank expression of like the sun in Capricorn, like Anthony Jeselnik, that doesn't break at any point or has that just a completely calm exterior, even when like completely dismantling someone.
Yeah. And then, oh God, I could get like, now I'm just like on a Google hole of like, now I'm thinking of like Sam Kinison in terms of like the, like such opposite wild energy. And then I'm seeing a Capricorn moon at yet again, and Scorpio Mercury. Anyways.
Punishing. Okay.
Punishing. Just what?
So I think the final thing to wrap this up and just to leave with people with some questions is, one of the things that's really interesting that astrology might provide an interesting access point also is just, why does some comedians sometimes become more eminent than others, or why does some comedians become legendary? And what does it mean to have, on the one hand, let's say financial success as a comedian, versus what does it mean, or what does it look like astrologically to have success amongst comedians within your field and to be respected as a comedian as part of the craft, as opposed to like notoriety or financial success or what have you, as well as the distinction that we've kind of gotten at a little bit here in some occasions of, why do some comedians peak earlier than others, and like at young ages or at middle ages, or eventually sometimes at very late ages. And, when does that happen in terms of the timing, and seeing that the astrology also can potentially speak to that through things like the transits or other timing techniques. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. I know me and Catherine Urban in the episode on the secondary progressed lunation cycle did a whole discussion where one of the charts we talked about was Dave Chappelle and the different sort of eras in his career that seemed to match very well like the secondary progressed lunation cycle. So that could be a whole separate topic at some point, as we could get more into the actual timing of some of this, and that might be interesting for another episode.
Yeah. There's definitely some undoings that have come about in comedy?
Well, I think it's just like anything. I think that there's your like intention when you start out as a comedian for what you want to do and how that lines up with timing and how that lines up with your life experience and the choices that you make. And then there's also people that are, will never be discovered the same way that there are people in other fields that will never be discovered in that same way. Not never, but because it also is like a rare and kind of small field as much as there is a long lineage of these people. I mean, how many, people get to achieve the biggest like success. There's not that many people that achieve those like heights too. And what is that for anybody? It always is an intersection of, hard work, experience, timing, luck, all of these things. I think it just is like the study of astrology in and of itself is that you can see things that are clear when you look at someone's chart. You go, oh, that makes total sense. But we only know that with hindsight and with these things combined and all of that. There isn't a way to necessarily predict who's going to be a comedian's comedian, who's going to be the next big, huge star, because we don't know what's happening in the rest of the world. And there's so many other people like television executives and casting and these sorts of things that like come to a thing. I don't know. It's the magic of it too.
I think too, it can go ahead.
There might be some way though, I think, in which with some of these comedians, we've seen how there's been some parts of their chart, especially with the houses or certain aspects that have shown things that have given them a leg up in the field or that they've been able to utilize in their career, whether it's through relationships or through leveraging technology or having a friend that helped them out, having a parent that was already in the industry, through a sibling and something like that. It's like there's so many different things that sometimes are described in the chart where if somebody came in to see you who would later be like a famous comedian like a Jerry Seinfeld or something, you might see some indications, especially some of the ancient techniques or eminence. But even beyond that, you might see that like a friend or a business partner will be really important to you in the shaping of your career. And that could be accurately describing the fact that he would later like partner up with, a friend in order to create his most, famous television show.
Oh, yeah.
I think there's people we can even just study singularly their chart to see someone like Bobcat Goldthwait, who I think has embodied both things, who has had meteoric stardom and also is like known as a comedian's comedian. And I feel like comics are able to get a hold of him or get him on shows, and he's very generous. And I do feel like he's one of the people that people come into the room to watch, maybe not necessarily like young audience members who've never been to a comedy show before, but the comics are going to come in and watch him, and so I think there is the opportunity for both. And, I haven't studied obviously all of the transits in his natal chart, but that's just, I don't know, an interesting look.
I think another one too that comes to mind is Mark Maron, who is definitely like a dude's dude, but also was, in his own words, like a loser, like in terms of seeing all of his friends rise to stardom, and then really had, what the fuck with Mark Maron was the turning point for him to have that experience in the comedy world, and maybe didn't achieve the comedy success, but then have it through living a comedian's life and having access to these people and all that stuff. So I think it is like everyone's journey and path, how they get there is so unique. And I'm glad you brought up Nepo babies, Chris, too, because that is definitely part of some people's story.
Well, I was thinking of like Pauly Shore being like the son of Mitzi Shore, who runs the Comedy Store, and therefore he kind of had a leg up in terms of having a family connection, and then eventually being able to use that to have a successful career for a little bit in movies or as a movie star. And then there's other people whose lives who were very promising rising stars, but whose lives were cut tragically short, like Chris Farley, for example.
Yeah.
I think it's just like there is something you can use in your chart, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee a meteoric rise, but we're not all, I don't know, everyone's different. And if you are open to, I don't know, following something that you like doing, I think comedy, if we haven't established this, it's grueling and you have to do it a lot, and it's a thing that takes time to get good at. And I think even people that maybe have a meteoric rise early on still have to continue to get good. And where do you go from there? I think it's like, it's not done. It doesn't end there. Even if you're successful, now you are navigating that, like we've said with some of these examples, in front of everybody with an expectation that maybe you don't have if you aren't there. But I think that there's a bunch of different ways to get there, and there's a bunch of different forms that comedy and success can take. And if you are kind of aware of what's available in your chart and are kind of true to what's there in your experience, I think that is something that's like universally successful for people. Again, it's like you might hit some walls on the way there with timing, but when you are honest and using what you have, your life experience, like that's where comedy comes from. It's from your point of view, from your experience, from your tension within your chart, and being aware of how you might be able to leverage that with things like technology or something too might be a thing that, like, you don't always have to take a traditional path, and looking to your chart for ways that you might be able to kind of deviate and leverage that, I think is cool.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And maybe that's something that could be really useful for comedians using astrology, is using it to find your strengths and weaknesses. And that it almost seems like through all these charts we've looked at, that there's something about the process of living authentically and finding yourself during the course of your life and your journey through comedy. And to the extent that astrology can help or can complement that, it might be like a useful tool.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it is that thing of astrology too, where it's like, even though we can all have generational planets that are the same, you never see the same chart for someone. And so really your only job is to like live authentically and to be yourself. And I think that that's like true for no matter what you're doing. The more you can kind of find and be yourself, at least the happier you will be, hopefully.
I think too, at least what I've taken away from what we've been talking about is, I think coming in, I'm thinking Mercury, like Avi, right? Like how we're communicating, how we're processing. And then, some mention of Venus with like the things that we care about. And those feel just very like intrinsic to us. But what's now got me really excited, and I think if you're a performer or someone that's trying to create art or be seen on a more visible level, I think where your energy is best served with Mars has been a really fascinating point that keeps coming up in our conversation. Where you're leaving your mark with Pluto feels very, very like on the nose with a lot of these prominent Pluto placements. And then I think Uranus, where you're willing to go there, like where can you like surprise yourself? And I think you'll always like have how you speak, and which some people can put on a voice or change things. So like also can be fluid and flexible. But I think there are other signatures in these charts that were I was like a little more surprised by how much Mars, Pluto, Uranus was like coming up as we were discussing. And I think those typically in a chart, people get afraid of those planets. It's like, oh, that's like, I'm thinking just like very pop astrology sensibilities, like Mars, oh no, like, am I going to get cut? Or like, Uranus, it's like going to fuck up my life. And Pluto is death, but it's also like, you're making a statement. You're like marked in history. Even coming back to George Carlin's stuff of changing laws, like that's huge. So I think, being open to the scary parts is very comedy as well. The tragedy of life. And if you are in that lull or dull time, like that's probably, we've all been there. Like
it's material.
It's material.
It's all
babe.
material, baby.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it seems like we've found a way throughout the course of this, which is actually really interesting. And I'm glad we had this journey where we found where almost every planet played a role in comedy in some way, or what it contributed, looking at each comedian's charts, the ascendant to one's appearance and like physical mannerisms, to Mercury and their communication style, to Venus and maybe their aesthetic sensibilities, to Mars and their ability to assert themselves, but also sometimes to go against the grain or to say the thing that might be like caustic.
Mm-hmm.
What else? To Uranus.
I was going to say Jupiter was probably our least talked about planet overall.
Which is funny. I mean, yeah, because you would think that, I think that was maybe an oversight on our part, but there's probably something we were just not picking up there.
I don't know. I think that there's a misconception, because I think Jupiter is that, like, I don't know, Jupiter feels more beloved to me. And I think that comedy, there's a misconception of, while you're like making people laugh, you're often, again, you're saying things that are kind of potentially controversial or potentially mean or things that people don't necessarily want to hear. And I think that like Jupiter benefic expansive sort of thing is like, I don't want to say a detriment to comedy, but it's almost like it's the highest position sort of thing. And I think comedy is kind of about taking not necessarily the underdog position, but it is like it's you against other people. And I think Jupiter maybe is coming in like an inflated sense of self or purpose or success financially, success commercially. But
save it for the politicians.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
No, yeah. I think it is that, like, I don't know.
I think with Jupiter, what you're talking about being in the highest position is like punching down is never really fun. So we're trying to figure out a way to put ourselves, even if we are in a high position, show ourselves in this way where we're not punching down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, and there's also, I think there's different types of comedy in terms of some comedy might be done more at the detriment of somebody else, but then there's other types of comedy that might not be done at the detriment of somebody else. And it just makes me think, like, recently I just saw that Adam Sandler was given the Mark Twain Award for comedy or something like that. And I know he has Jupiter in Cancer in the sign of its exaltation, and there might be something relevant there in terms of his style of comedy or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, big
and
broad
Virgo.
appeal, big budget movies and large success as like a comedic performer, but not necessarily like stand up, and that doesn't matter. It's not necessarily what he wants to do, even though he's returned to it and has had these moments of it, and I think is a good stand up, but is beloved in this way that I want to say loses a little bit of an edge. I don't know.
Yeah,
created
his early stuff, like he had some audio recordings I used to listen to in like middle school. They were really funny, like way back in the day.
Piece of shit car, and we're all going to hell is like one of
longest pee. Anyone?
Yeah.
Absolutely hysterical. Absolutely love it.
I love Adam Sandler.
Yeah, love him.
Anyway, but when you said, I only bring up Jupiter just because I think Jupiter, of course, is going to play a part, but it just wasn't at the naturally, organically at the top of our combos. But you mentioned Chris Farley, and I was thinking, who's more Jupiterian than Chris Farley? And of course, he's got Jupiter Aries conjunct his midheaven. And I think the other thing we hear a lot in comedy is those who end up overdoing, going really big and wanting to be liked and wanting to say yes to everything. And that can be sometimes that can take a tragic turn a lot of the times, where it's a lot of that say yes, Jupiter, go big or go home.
And he's so big and so seen too. And I think with Sandler's Jupiter and Cancer, we see him creating this film family, this family of people that you see in all of his movies that, when it's a whole thing, like it's its own individual thing.
Yeah.
And that's one thing they say about him and his like filmography over the past 10 or 15 years, while it's not like regarded as being like the best comedy, that he's just getting together as friends to like go away on a vacation and do a movie, and then they make a bunch of money from it, and it's great. So while it might not be like the height of whatever comedians like comedy, it's sort of like an excuse for him, and he's enjoying his life and is being successful in that. So it's like what success actually is, that's actually an interesting point, is going to be different for different people throughout the field.
Yeah. Well, and the authenticity too of, I think, coming back to like Dane Cook, getting that sellout vibe, and being a comedian's like, I think everybody loves the Sandman, Adam Sandler's a beloved guy. And it's because I think you can feel that in his movies, no matter how, like, comedy should be dumb. Like, we're here to be a bit dumb. We're here to turn our brains off a little bit.
Right. Or to have sometimes like wacky or like zany humor, like Conan O'Brien, for example, and like what his show was like in the 90s and how different that was compared to like earlier shows like Johnny Carson or something like that, and the types of skits that they would do. That brings us also into that realm of Uranus, but also of timing and stuff. Like that was a really good example of somebody who kind of got screwed, because he got the Tonight Show. He finally achieved like this dream of his to get the Tonight Show, but then in less than a year it was kind of like ripped away from him, and he lost it and had to come back from that. And it's been interesting seeing him complete his second Saturn return over the past few years, which has been him. He launched a successful podcast several years ago, but I think he sold it for like millions of dollars or something like that in the past year or two, so that this was truly him sort of coming back from that and redefining himself in that space.
Mhm.
Yeah. Well, and he has like I love Conan, but what a classic, like went to Harvard, part of the boys club, like had that very, if you do this path, you're going to get wrote on The Simpsons. Like you're going to have this very, like, I'm not discrediting like the work he done. And that late night stuff was very messed up. Like how that all went down with Jay Leno being like, actually, no, like that was a pretty good Jay Leno impression. I just did it. Actually, did you guys hear that?
I did.
That kind of came through. That came through. But yeah, like I don't want to discredit it, but I think that's another part of like when we get into Nepo babies, the very like obvious kind of white dude route of comedy that can come up with Harvard and whatnot.
Yeah. Some of it, he was working as a comedy writer in The Simpsons, and then his first Saturn return is kind of interesting because of how random it was that he ended up getting the late night show, and how tenuous it was at first, and how sort of criticized he was early on.
Well, and what you're able to do when you are, again, like an underdog given a position kind of, but not by chance, because obviously you've been working and you are a capable comedian in your own right, but not necessarily on track to inherit this thing, and how the kind of risks you can take there are different than someone who is given a ready-made late night spot and the conventions that you have to kind of contain to, and then how that then gives your own kind of style, and people are rooting for you because you do these kind of innovative things. But then if you want to kind of pivot, and the changes that you have to make that late night, and then those timing things too, but the like, you know, nothing's in a vacuum, and it all like lends its own thing to each other and creates good comedy.
Yeah.
I think that can like transition us towards Saturn too, because I find, you know, with him having his Saturn return now, and he's definitely a comic who does Conan O'Brien Presents. He uplifts other comics, and I find that a very second Saturn return type of energy. But also I could see with having what happened to him in late night, he could have really gone the other way of like, it's dog eat dog, fend for yourself. But no, he's chosen to uplift other people. And I know from people who've worked for him that those people, there's zero turnover at Conan, or was, or whatever, where it's like they're there forever. They want to work for him. He's a great boss. He treats you well. So it's like kind of that passing along the torch thing, I think, is interesting in that second Saturn return.
That's
one
really
of the few late night tapings I've seen too was Conan, and I was shocked how he was acting like it was the first, like the pep, the energy, the excitement, being friendly with the audience. I was just like, you've been doing this for so long. Like you do not have to be, most of these people are this nice and this excited to be here. So it's very, Conan has like I don't mean this in a, like that lovable loserness, which is also a kind of archetype in comedy as well, where talk about self-deprecating is like, he's always like, I'm disgusting. It's like, oh,
right.
Conan.
He has that early Virgo rising with Uranus, which is like the unconventional or the zaniness conjunct the ascendant, but also Pluto there on the ascendant, which can be very sort of intensely introspective and aware of one's faults. But it's interesting mentioning his relationship with like employees and stuff, because he has the moon and Saturn in Aquarius in the 6th house in a day chart. And that was one of the things about the 6th house is traditionally the place of like employees. And when he lost the Tonight Show, one of the things that he did was to go on a tour immediately afterwards. And part of his motivation for that was not just that he wanted to do that, but because it wasn't just him that was fired, but his entire crew, which had been set up with the Tonight Show, was also just lost their jobs. So he was concerned to keep everyone employed. So that 6th house placement and having the moon there, which is kind of a nurturing significator, and having actually a concern for one's employees or what have you.
Well, seeing that Pluto on the ascendant too, and it being not necessarily the self undoing, but that like zany quirkiness that makes you beloved is also maybe a reason why outside forces would go like, actually, we're going to stick with this guy that we know works. We don't want this like kook coming in and, you know, whatever. But you got to stay true to you, because that's also what we don't want. Conan straight. Like, that's not Conan. That's also not why we like love him and why we all wanted him to take over that spot. And it's like, what are you going to change? You're going to give up that for this other thing, be someone else? Like, you can't.
I think that Aquarius moon with Saturn too, I think we hear so much with Aquarius energy, especially in the moon space, as this cold, kind of detached, whatever. But then there's also, I think, that reminder of Aquarius and community and being the example. And I think, yeah, it's so easy. Again, back to Dane Cook. And sorry, Dane, if you're, well, I don't know, we can talk, but come here and defend yourself. But I think too, to have that, like, not selling out, like, or cashing in, because that's, a lot of people do sign away. This may be on a different note, but with like music, like their rights to what they own or like who they are or those sorts of things. And it seems like he really stuck with himself and what he felt was right. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. And most people don't do that.
For sure. Go ahead, Lisa.
Oh, I was just going to say, I thought I saw some Capricorn stuff, and Conan O'Brien can't stop. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
That was all I had.
Sustainable King.
Oh, it's Virgo stuff that I was looking at. Still can't stop. Capricorn North Node at 24 degrees. Can't stop.
Mm-hmm. I think Leo Mars in the 12th too is very coming back to that self-deprecating, because you think of Leo Mars as like, there's such a confidence in his deprecation as well. Like, you don't feel like there's like, I know he's being real about this, but it's also like, come on, Conan. Like, you're clearly loved, but go off, King.
I like also his Venus is like very well placed. It's exalted in Pisces in the 7th house. And he actually met his wife while doing a skit where he went to like an ad agency and got them to make an ad for like a mattress store or something like that. And one of the women working there that was like a writer, he met and they hit it off. And then later they've been married now for like 20 years or something like that. So it's interesting seeing things like that of different areas where even comedians have, like, you know, success or failure or different things that happen, sometimes showing up in the chart, or areas of ease and difficulty and things like that. But a lot of it has to do with like sometimes just chance and fate and circumstance, and sometimes being in the right place at the right time.
Well, again, I think that's like being true to who you are. You're someone who has like a quote unquote successful relationship with someone who met someone and hit it off, and I think that can be where some of that confidence comes from too, where it's like, yeah, you can be self-deprecating because you know that you have someone who loves you or whatever, and kind of not trying to fight that, using that as a strength. Being yourself. I mean,
and while it is like thinking in stand-up like a solo art, you need the people, you know, you need back to butts and seats. Like you don't want to be doing stand-up to an empty room.
Right. Yeah.
Unless that's what you're going for.
Yeah.
And also with that's actually a really good example. It can be a final point, but because he has Uranus and Pluto on the degree of the ascendant, I've noticed sometimes people that have outer planets on an angle or very closely aligned with personal points in the chart, sometimes that generational sort of influence or significations of the outer planets can mean that the person somehow represents like generations of people, or it can be tied in with generational differences and generational shifts. And it was like, that was one of the sort of differences between like Conan primarily becoming successful with like college age kids in the 1990s and forward, and that generation of people continuing to be sort of his fan base, as opposed to the older generation that didn't really like get his comedy. And that was one of the reasons he struggled later with things like The Tonight Show with that first year of ratings, where he was trying to then jump up to speaking to the older generation when his base had always been like younger people. So that might be another interesting thing to explore at some point, which is just generational differences and different comedians that come to stand out in terms of different generations of people.
Absolutely.
Look, Aries are cool. You know, like you can't, some people, we've also, that's been, I think, a dividing line we've seen is like, some people are cool. And then some people are more for the establishment, whether that is a wider audience or something more digestible or what have you. And yeah, even though Conan would be like, I'm cool, it's like, you're cool.
I think talking about those generational and, you know, the rest of the planets out to Pluto generationally, I think we see obviously with culture, I mean, we've seen a rise of female comedians alongside the Me Too movement and talking about, you know, sexual assault and all of those kind of things in the news, but also in the comedy sphere. And so I do think there's a reflection of those things both ways. It's, you know, obviously it can get down to individual houses and signs and all of those things, but I do think there is a cultural shift that happens with comedy.
Absolutely.
For sure.
And now that we're recognizing that we need more, that diversity is lacking in all areas of kind of culture, that why would comedy be different? And now that we're encouraging that, to see what comes of that is exciting to be a part of.
Yeah. And one of the things on that note is that people, like astrologers, based on their interests and their own background, tend to seek out the birth charts and the birth times of people that they follow. And there's a lot of shift, like we said earlier in this episode, of like having only certain demographics represented. And I think as astrologers now of younger generations that have different interests in people, it would be great if astrologers these days went out of their way to ask some of their favorite comedians, like what is their birth time, so that we can have a more representative sort of cross section of people when we're able to look at charts and stuff like this, since so many of the charts that we have right now tend to be from previous generations where it was more male dominated. But that's something I'm excited about, and that a lot of the charts that each of you contributed today really showed a much better representation. But I hope that's something that continues to improve as we move into the future.
I think that's a good point to say, because to lean into plugs at the end of when we have guest episodes on What's Your Sign, we always play Marry, Fuck, Kill. If you don't know, it's a game where you play with 3 celebrities. One you'll marry, one you'll kill, one you'll fuck. It's like we're a comedy podcast. Have a sense of humor. It's okay. No one's actually dying or getting fucked or getting married. But that's something we've come across too, is like, it's like, wow, there's a lot of white dudes who we have their time. And like, this is just so disproportional of who is a celebrity we can play with or what have you. So yeah, just echoing that too. And if you want to hear who Chris MF'd or definitely listen to his episode. He played with us.
Well, I think it's
very sweating and nervous about getting canceled when we play that game. But interesting point about that with the data selection that's weird is when I was thinking about that, when reading through our lists of times that we had and looking through that data bank and wondering, because on the one hand, whether it was, because one of the things is, while we mainly have male comedian birth data at this point that was collected by data collectors over the past several decades, in astrology, still for the past several decades, there's been most of the practitioners of astrology have been women. So it's actually been interesting that even the data collectors have been women. So it's been interesting seeing that even with the field of astrology being dominated by women, that sometimes maybe their collection tendencies have been towards male comedians, or maybe it's just because the field of comedians has been so dominated by men up until relatively recently, and thinking about like what the cause of that is or how to balance that.
Well, I think it's remembering that we are actively taking a role in like creating astrology and the data that we have. And I think a lot of times it can feel like it's because it is an ancient tool that's like has these established things, and we must just have this kind of database that exists that we refer to, that whatever. But it's also like we get to keep making that and storing that and feeling like we are taking an active role and that we have a part to play. And that's not necessarily something that I always think of for myself, but this was a good reminder to go like, yeah, if you get someone's birth time, like let's put that there so people can see it, because it is like I think this is like a problem of culture in general, where it's like we can only learn from what we have to learn from. And if we want more diversity and more examples and greater things so people can know that those people exist and that there are references, then we get to also like help create that.
Ask in every green room. I know that there are people in comedy spaces too who love astrology, and probably a ton of them are listening. I know I recently did a show at a club here in LA, and one of the people that was, a photographer there was wearing like a full zodiac outfit. And I was like, oh, look, here's a friend. It's like, it's always nice to see it when it's not, I'm not going into every comedy club being like, you guys like astrology. It's cool when it shows up for you.
Oh yeah, if you Google astrology jokes, let's just say it ain't good. It's not very good out there. It's very rarely pro astrology. Let's just say that. But yeah, if you got a famous cousin, get that birth time, plug it in. Ask if you're listening, DM your favorite celebrity that doesn't have a birth time right now. Maybe they'll respond. You never know.
Yeah, but I like that, because that's part of our empirical tradition that astrologists have been doing for over 4,000 years now, is just like observing the correlations between people's birth charts and what happens in their lives. And that's how we learn and grow as astrologers. And this has been a really interesting exploration of that today, and probably a really under researched area. So yeah, thank you all for joining me today. This has been amazing. Where can people find out more information, or tell me a bit more about your podcast and like where people can find it and how frequently you do episodes and stuff like that?
Totally. Well, we're What's Your Sign, an astrology podcast for lovers and haters. Yes, we welcome skeptics. We have new episodes every Monday. You can get it wherever you get your podcasts. We're also on YouTube, so you can watch video episodes as well. At What's Your Sign podcast at most social media platforms.
Socials.
Besides Twitter. It's truly besides Twitter, because they have weird character limits, and that's just something that really should.
I mean, let's not even open the can of worms that is
on Twitter.
Twitter's tenuous existence as of now. So
if you like comedy and you want to come see stand up, Chatterbox Comedy Night is every Sunday at 8:00, and it's at the Chatterbox in Covina. Maybe potentially growing to other locations soon as well.
Yeah. But if you want to see not necessarily comedians we discussed, because most of the comedians we discussed are dead, but your new favorites, some of the best people that are working today, I think that we have truly some of the best lineups that you don't see anywhere else, and we really pride ourselves on that. And it's a fun show. We've been doing it for over 10 years, and yeah.
Dude, the Chatterbox rocks. It's a fun time too. So if you've been feeling stuck home in your astrology books, come on out, like hang out. And I should say too, for What's Your Sign, episodes typically will be about maybe like current transits that are happening. Sometimes it's more general topics on, say, just the moon as a concept. We'll have guests on in both the astrology realm and comedy realm. Chris was a past guest. And yeah, we have a little fun over there. Come hang.
Cool. Awesome.
And we were just talking, because we were all hanging out last night. And we were just talking like 2018 needs to be, because that was the year we launched. And it's like, I felt like that was such a astro renaissance. And we were talking to friends of like, is there like, I think we'll see the waves of astrology being popular, air quotes, but yeah, we definitely launched during a boom time, whether we knew it or not.
Yeah, that was literally when astrology just started getting really popular. I think slightly before that, or just slightly after that, because right around that time, a bunch of articles started coming out on in the media. The media was like, "Why is astrology getting so popular?"
It's like, we're lost. We don't know what else to do. Help us, God.
Because it rules. That's why.
Yes, right. And that too, and it builds community. And I think too. Oh, this is what I'll plug is also, if you end up loving us, which I know you will, we also have a Patreon. Patreon.com/What's Your Sign podcast. We have a Discord community. We have monthly bonus episodes for the new moon and full moon. Also, like if we have live events, which we've had in LA, we're based in Los Angeles, we'll hit you up and let you know things. But I think what we've learned, which I don't think we knew we were going to learn from starting the podcast, was you learn a lot by just kind of what we did today is just like, how does that Capricorn moon feel? Like, how does it feel being a Taurus rising? Like just sharing lived experience, which is, I think that kind of folkloric, verbal sharing stories sort of way is a great way to learn astrology. Of course, there's the books and like, learn, you should know with the planets and houses and aspects and all that. But I think also just sharing your life is a great learning tool for astrology too.
Yeah. And sitting around with friends and just talking astrology. And I think that's the thing the three of you are able to recreate the best is, what that's like to have other close friends that are into astrology that you can just chat about stuff with. So I think people should definitely check out your podcast. I'll put a link to your website in the description below this video on YouTube, or on the podcast website in the entry for this episode. But yeah, I think that's it. So thanks a lot for joining me.
Yes. Thank you so much for having us. This was so fun.
All right. Thanks everyone for watching or listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time.
Bye.
Special thanks to all the patrons that helped to support the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Issa Sabah, Jake Otero, Mimi Stargazer, and Jean-Marie Kaplan. If you appreciate the work I'm doing here on the podcast and you'd like to find a way to support it, then please consider becoming a patron through our page on patreon.com. In exchange, you can get access to bonus content that's only available to patrons of the podcast, such as early access to new episodes, the ability to attend the live recording of the monthly forecast episodes, our monthly auspicious elections podcast, or another exclusive podcast series called the Casual Astrology Podcast, or you can even get your name listed in the credits at the end of each episode. For more information, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. If you're looking to get an astrological consultation, we have a list of recommended astrologers at theastrologypodcast.com/consultations. The astrologers on the list are friends of the podcast that have been featured in different episodes over the years, and they have different specialties such as natal astrology, electional astrology, synastry, rectification, or horary astrology. You can get a 10% discount when you book a consultation with one of the astrologers on our list by using the promo code Astrology Podcast. The astrology software that we use and recommend here on the podcast is called Solar Fire for Windows, which is available for the PC at alabe.com. Use the promo code AP15 to get a 15% discount. For Mac users, we recommend a software program called Astro Gold for Mac OS, which is from the creators of Solar Fire for PC, and it includes both modern and traditional techniques. You can find out more information at astrogold.io, and you can use the promo code AstroPodcast15 to get a 15% discount. If you'd like to learn more about my approach to astrology, then I'd recommend checking out my book titled Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune, where I go over the history, philosophy, and techniques of ancient astrology, taking people from beginner up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. You can get a print copy of the book through Amazon or other online retailers, or there's an ebook version available through Google Books. If you're really looking to expand your studies of astrology, then I would recommend my Hellenistic Astrology course, which is an online course on ancient astrology where I take people through basic concepts up through intermediate and advanced techniques for reading birth charts. There's over 100 hours of video lectures as well as guided readings of ancient texts, and by the time you finish the course, you will have a strong foundation in how to read birth charts as well as make predictions. You can find out more information at courses.theastrologyschool.com. And finally, thanks to our sponsors, including the Mountain Astrologer magazine, which is a quarterly astrology magazine which you can read in print or online at mountainastrologer.com. Thanks also to the Starscribe Astrology and Journaling app, which is currently running a Kickstarter campaign through April 22nd, 2023 to fund an exciting new mobile app for astrologers. Find out more information at starscribe.co. Finally, thanks also to the Northwest Astrology Conference, which is happening May 25th through the 29th, 2023, just outside of Seattle. This year's conference is going to be a hybrid conference where you can either attend online or in person. Find out more information at norwac.net.